Book 2, The Haunted Man. The story according to Sidney Atherton, Esquire. Chapter 10, Rejected. It was after our second waltz I did it, in the usual quiet corner, which, that time, was in the shadow of a palm in the hall. Before I had got into my stride, she checked me, touching my sleeve with her fan, turning towards me with startled eyes. "Stop, please!" But I was not to be stopped. Cliff Chalonnais passed, with Gertie Cazelle. I fancy that as he passed, he nodded. I did not care. I was wound up to go, and I went it. No man knows how he can talk till he does talk, to the girl he wants to marry. It is my impression that I gave her recollections of the Restoration poets. She seemed surprised, not having previously detected in me the poetic strain, and insisted on cutting in. "Mr. Atherton, I am so sorry." Then I did let fly. "Sorry that I love you." Why? Why should you be sorry that you have become the one thing needful in any man's eyes, even in mine? The one thing precious, the one thing to be altogether esteemed. Is it so common for a woman to come across a man who would be willing to lay down his life for her that she should be sorry when she finds him? I did not know that you felt like this, though I confess that I have had my doubts. Doubts! I thank you. You are quite aware, Mr. Atherton, that I like you very much. Like me! Bah! I cannot help liking you, though it may be bah. I don't want you to like me. I want you to love me. Precisely. That is your mistake. My mistake in wanting you to love me when I love you? Then you shouldn't, though I can't help thinking that you are mistaken even there. Mistaken in supposing that I love you when I assert and reassert it with the whole force of my being. What do you want me to do to prove I love you? Take you in my arms and crush you to my bosom and make a spectacle of you before every creature in the place? I'd rather you wouldn't, and perhaps you wouldn't mind not talking quite so loud. Mr. Chalonnais seems to be wondering what you're shouting about. You shouldn't torture me. She opened and shut her fan. As she looked down at it, I am disposed to suspect that she smiled. I'm glad we have had this little explanation, because, of course, you are my friend. I am not your friend. Pardon me, you are. I say I'm not. If I can't be something else, I'll be no friend. She went on, calmly ignoring me, playing with her fan. As it happens, I am, just now, in rather a delicate position, in which a friend is welcome. What's the matter? Who's been worrying you? Your father? Well, he has not, as yet, but he may be soon. What's in the wind? Mr. Lessingham. She dropped her voice and her eyes. For the moment I did not catch her meaning. What? Your friend, Mr. Lessingham. Excuse me, Miss Linden, but I'm by no means sure that anyone is entitled to call Mr. Lessingham a friend of mine. What? Not when I'm going to be his wife? That took me aback. I had had my suspicions that Paul Lessingham was more with Marjorie than he had any right to be, but I had never supposed that she could see anything desirable in a stick of a man like that, not to speak of 101 other considerations. Lessingham on one side of the house and her father on the other, and old Linden girding at him anywhere and everywhere, with his high-dried Tory notions of his family importance, to say nothing of his fortune. I don't know if I looked what I felt. If I did, I looked uncommonly blank. You have chosen an appropriate moment, Miss Linden, to make to me such a communication. She chose to disregard my irony. I'm glad you think so, because now you will understand what a difficult position I am in. I offer you my hearty congratulations, and I thank you for them, Mr. Atherton, in the spirit in which they are offered, because from you I know they mean so much. I bit my lip. For the life of me, I could not tell how she wished me to read her words. Do I understand that this announcement has been made to me as one of the public? You do not. It is made to you, in confidence, as my friend, as my greatest friend, because a husband is something more than friend. My pulses tingled. You will be on my side? She had paused, and I stayed silent. On your side, or Mr. Lessingham's? His side is my side, and my side is his side. You will be on our side. I'm not sure that I altogether follow you. You are the first I have told. When Papa hears, it is possible that there will be trouble, as you know. He thinks so much of you and of your opinion. When that trouble comes, I want you to be on our side, on my side. Why should I? What does it matter? You are stronger than your father. It is just possible that Lessingham is stronger than you. Together, from your father's point of view, you will be invincible. You are my friend. Are you not my friend? In effect, you offer me an apple of Sodom. Thank you. I did not think you so unkind. And you, are you kind? I make you an avowal of my love, and straightway you ask me to act as chorus to the love of another. How could I tell you loved me, as you say? I had no notion. You have known me all your life, yet you have not breathed a word of it till now. If I had spoken before, I imagined that there was a slight movement of her shoulders, almost amounting to a shrug. I do not know that it would have made any difference. I do not pretend that it would, but I do know this. I believe that you yourself have only discovered the state of your own mind within the last half hour. If she had slapped my face, she could not have startled me more. I had no notion if her words were uttered at random, but they came so near the truth they held me breathless. It was a fact that only during the last few minutes had I really realized how things were with me. Only since the end of that first waltz that the flame had burst out in my soul, which was now consuming me. She had read me by what seemed so like a flash of inspiration that I hardly knew what to say to her. I tried to be stinging. You flatter me, Miss Linden. You flatter me at every point. Had you only discovered to me the state of your mind a little sooner, I should not have discovered to you the state of mine at all. We will consider it terra incognita, since you wish it. Her provoking calmness stung me, and the suspicion that she was laughing at me in her sleeve. I gave her a glimpse of the cloven hoof. But at the same time, since you assert that you have so long been innocent, I beg that you will continue so no more. At least your innocence shall be without excuse. For I wish you to understand that I love you, that I have loved you, that I shall love you. Any understanding you may have with Mr. Lessingham will not make the slightest difference. I warn you, Miss Linden, that until death you will have to write me down your lover. She looked at me with wide open eyes, as if I almost frightened her. To be frank, that was what I wished to do. Mr. Atherton, Miss Linden, that is not like you at all. We seem to be making each other's acquaintance for the first time. She continued to gaze at me with her big eyes, which, to be candid, I found it difficult to meet. On a sudden, her face was lighted by a smile, which I resented. Not after all these years. Not after all these years. I know you, and though I dare say you're not flawless, I fancy you'll be found to ring pretty true. Her manner was almost sisterly, elder sisterly. I could have shaken her. Partridge coming to claim his dance gave me an opportunity to escape with such remnants of dignity as I could gather about me. He dawdled up, his thumbs, as usual, in his waistcoat pockets. I believe, Miss Linden, this is our dance. She acknowledged it with a bow and rose to take his arm. I got up and left her without a word. As I crossed the hall, I chanced on Percy Woodville. He was in his familiar state of fluster and was gaping about him as if he had mislaid the Koh-i-Noor and wondered where in thunder it had got to. When he saw it was I, he caught me by the arm. I say, Atherton, have you seen Miss Linden? I have. No, have you? By Jove, where? I've been looking for her all over the place, except in the cellars and the attics, and I was just going to commence on them. This is our dance. In that case, she's shunted you. No, impossible. His mouth went like an O, and his eyes ditto, his eyeglass clattering down onto his shirt front. I expect the mistake's mine. Fact is, I've made a mess of my programme. It's either the last dance, or this dance, or the next that I've booked with her. But I'm hanged if I know which. Just take a squint at it, there's a good chap, and tell me which one you think it is. I took a squint. Since he held the thing within an inch of my nose, I could hardly help it. One squint, and that was enough, and more. Some men's ball programmes are studies in impressionism. Percy's seemed to me to be a study in madness. It was covered with hieroglyphics, but what they meant, or what they did there anyhow, it was absurd to suppose that I could tell. I never put them there. Proverbially, the man's a champion hasher. I regret, my dear Percy, that I am not an expert in cuneiform writing. If you have any doubt as to which dance is yours, you'd better ask the lady. She'll feel flattered. Leaving him to do his own addling, I went to find my coat. I panted to get into the open air. As for dancing, I felt that I loathed it. Just as I neared the cloakroom, someone stopped me. It was Dora Grayling. "Have you forgotten that this is our dance?" I had forgotten. Clean. And I was not obliged by her remembering. Though as I looked at her sweet grey eyes and at the soft contours of her gentle face, I felt that I deserved well kicking. She is an angel, one of the best, but I was in no mood for angels. Not for a very great deal would I have gone through that dance just then, nor, with Dora Grayling, of all women in the world, would I have sat it out. So I was a brute and blundered. "You must forgive me, Miss Grayling, but I'm not feeling very well, and I don't think I'm up to any more dancing. Good night." Chapter 11. A midnight episode. The weather out of doors was in tune with my frame of mind. I was in a deuce of a temper, and it was a deuce of a night. A keen northeast wind, warranted to take the skin right off you, was playing catch who catch can with intermittent gusts of blinding rain. Since it was not fit for a dog to walk, none of your cabs for me. Nothing would serve but pedestrian exercise. So I had it. I went down Park Lane, and the wind and rain went with me. Also, thoughts of Dora Grayling. What a bounder I had been, and was. If there is anything in worse taste than to book a lady for a dance, and then to leave her in the lurch, I should like to know what that thing is. When found, it ought to be made a note of. If any man of my acquaintance allowed himself to be guilty of such a felony in the first degree, I should cut him. I wished someone would try to cut me. I should like to see him at it. It was all Marjorie's fault, everything, past, present, and to come. I had known that girl when she was in long frocks. I had, at that period of our acquaintance, pretty recently got out of them, when she was advanced to short ones, and when once more she returned to long. And all that time, well, I was nearly persuaded that the whole of the time I had loved her. If I had not mentioned it, it was because I had suffered my affection, like the worm, to lie hidden in the bud, or whatever it is the fellow says. At any rate, I was perfectly positive that if I had had the faintest notion that she would ever seriously consider such a man as Lessingham, I should have loved her long ago. Lessingham! Why, he was old enough to be her father. At least, he was a good many years older than I was, and a wretched radical. It is true that on certain points I also am what some people would call a radical, but not a radical of the kind he is. Thank heaven, no. No doubt I have admired traits in his character, until I learnt this thing of him. I'm even prepared to admit that he is a man of ability, in his way, which is, emphatically, not mine. But to think of him in connection with such a girl as Marjorie Linden, preposterous. Why, the man's as dry as a stick, drier and cold as an iceberg, nothing but a politician, absolutely. He a lover. How I could fancy such a stroke of humour setting all the benches in a roar. Both by education and by nature, he was incapable of even playing such a part. As for being the thing, absurd. If you were to sink a shaft from the crown of his head to the soles of his feet, you would find inside him nothing but the dry bones of parties and of politics. What my Marjorie? If everyone had his own, she is mine, and in that sense, she always will be mine. What my Marjorie could see in such a dry as dust, out of which even to construct the rudiments of a husband was beyond my fathoming, such like agreeable reflections were fit company for the wind and the wet, so they bore me company all down the lane. I crossed at the corner, going round the hospital towards the square. This brought me to the abiding place of Paul the Apostle. Like the idiot I was, I went out into the middle of the street and stood a while in the mud to curse him and his house. On the whole, when one considers that that is the kind of man I can be, it is, perhaps, not surprising that Marjorie disdained me. "May your following," I cried. It is an absolute fact that the words were shouted, both in the house and out of it, no longer regard you as a leader. May your party follow after other gods. May your political aspirations wither, and your speeches be listened to by empty benches. May the speaker persistently and strenuously refuse to allow you to catch his eye, and at the next election, may your constituency reject you. Jehoram! What's that? I might well ask. Until that moment I had appeared to be the only lunatic at large, either outside the house or in it. But on a sudden, a second lunatic came on the scene, and that with a vengeance. A window was crashed open from within, the one over the front door, and someone came plunging through it onto the top of the portico. That it was a case of intended suicide, I made sure, and I began to be in hopes that I was about to witness the suicide of Paul. But I was not so assured of the intention when the individual in question began to scramble down the pillar of the porch in the most extraordinary fashion I ever witnessed. I was not even convinced of a suicidal purpose when he came tumbling down and lay sprawling in the mud at my feet. I fancy, if I had performed that portion of the act, I should have lain quiet for a second or two, to consider whereabouts I was, and which end of me was uppermost. But there was no nonsense of that sort about that singularly agile stranger. If he was not made of India rubber, he ought to have been. So to speak, before he was down, he was up. It was all I could do to grab at him before he was off like a rocket. Such a figure as he presented is seldom seen, at least in the streets of London. What he had done with the rest of his apparel, I'm not in a position to say. All that was left of it was a long, dark cloak which he strove to wrap round him. Save for that, and mud, he was bare as the palm of my hand. Yet it was his face that held me. In my time, I've seen strange expressions on men's faces, but never before one such as I saw on his. He looked like a man might look, who, after living a life of undiluted crime, at last finds himself face to face with the devil. It was not the look of a madman. Far from it. It was something worse. It was the expression on the man's countenance, as much as anything else, which made me behave as I did. I said something to him, some nonsense, I know not what. He regarded me with a silence which was supernatural. I spoke to him again. Not a word issued from those rigid lips. There was not a tremor of those awful eyes which I was tolerably convinced saw something which I had never seen or ever should. Then I took my hand from off his shoulder and let him go. I know not why. I did. He had remained as motionless as a statue while I held him. Indeed, for any evidence of life he gave, he might have been a statue. But when my grasp was loosed, how he ran! He had turned the corner and was out of sight before I could say, "How do?" It was only then, when he had gone, and I had realized the extra double express flash of lightning rate at which he had taken his departure, that it occurred to me of what an extremely sensible act I had been guilty in letting him go at all. Here was an individual who had been committing burglary, or something very like it, in the house of a budding cabinet minister, and who had tumbled plump into my arms, so that all I had to do was to call a policeman and get him quadded. And all that I had done was something of a totally different kind. You're a nice type of an ideal citizen, I was addressing myself, a first chop specimen of a low-down idiot, to connive at the escape of the robber who's been robbing Paul. Since you've let the villain go, the least you can do is to leave a card on the apostle and inquire how he's feeling. I went to Lessingham's front door and knocked. I knocked once, I knocked twice, I knocked thrice, and the third time, I give you my word, I made the echoes ring. But still there was not a soul that answered. If this is a case of a 7 or 70-fold murder, and the gentleman in the cloak has made a fair clearance of every living creature the house contains, perhaps it's just as well I've chanced upon the scene. Still, I do think that one of the corpses might get up to answer the door. If it is possible to make noise enough to waken the dead, you bet I'm onto it. And I was. I punished that knocker, until I warrant the pounding I gave. It was audible on the other side of Green Park, and at last I woke the dead, or rather, I roused Matthews to a consciousness that something was going on. Opening the door about 6 inches, through the interstice he protruded his ancient nose. "Who's there?" "Nothing, my dear sir, nothing and no one. It must have been your vigorous imagination which induced you to suppose that there was. You let it run away with you." Then he knew me, and opened the door about 2 feet. "Oh, it's you, Mr. Atherton. I beg your pardon, sir. I thought it might have been the police." "What then?" "Do you stand in terror of the minions of the law, at last?" A most discreet servant. Matthews. Just the fellow for a budding cabinet minister. He glanced over his shoulder. I had suspected the presence of a colleague at his back. Now I was assured. He put his hand up to his mouth, and I thought how exceedingly discreet he looked, in his trousers and his stockinged feet, and with his hair all rumpled and his braces dangling behind, and his nightshirt creased. "Well, sir, I have received instructions not to admit the police." "The deuce you have! From whom?" Coughing behind his hand, leaning forward, he addressed me with an air which was flatteringly confidential. "From Mr. Lessingham, sir." Possibly, Mr. Lessingham is not aware that a robbery has been committed on his premises, that the burglar has just come out of his drawing-room window with a hop, skip, and a jump, bounded out of the window like a tennis ball, flashed round the corner like a rocket. Again Matthews glanced over his shoulder, as if not clear which way discretion lay, whether fore or aft. "Thank you, sir. I believe that Mr. Lessingham is aware of something of the kind." He seemed to come to a sudden resolution, dropping his voice to a whisper. "The fact is, sir, that I fancy Mr. Lessingham's a good deal upset." "Upset?" I stared at him. There was something in his manner I did not understand. "What do you mean by upset? Has the scoundrel attempted violence? Who's there?" The voice was Lessingham's, calling to Matthews from the staircase, though for an instant I hardly recognised it. It was so curiously petulant. Pushing past Matthews, I stepped into the hall. A young man, I suppose a footman, in the same undress as Matthews, was holding a candle. It seemed the only light about the place. By its glimmer, I perceived Lessingham standing halfway up the stairs. He was in full war paint. As he is not the sort of man who dresses for the house, I took it that he had been mixing pleasure with business. "It's I, Lessingham, Atherton. Do you know that a fellow has jumped out of your drawing-room window?" It was a second or two before he answered. When he did, his voice had lost its petulance. "Has he escaped?" "Clean. He's a mile away by now." It seemed to me that in his tone, when he spoke again, there was a note of relief. I wondered if he had. Poor fellow, more sinned against than sinning. "Take my advice, Atherton, and keep out of politics. They bring you into contact with all the lunatics at large. Good night. I'm much obliged to you for knocking us up." Matthews shut the door. Tolerably cool, on my honour. A man who brings news big with the fate of Rome does not expect to receive such treatment. He expects to be listened to with deference, and to hear all that there is to hear, and not to be sent to the right about before he has had a chance of really opening his lips. Before I knew it, almost, the door was shut, and I was on the doorstep. Confound the apostle's impudence. Next time, he might have his house burnt down, and him in it, before I took the trouble to touch his dirty knocker. What did he mean by his allusion to lunatics in politics? Did he think to fool me? There was more in the business than met the eye, and a good deal more than he wished to meet mine. Hence his insolence. The creature. What Marjorie Linden could see in such an opusculum surpassed my comprehension, especially when there was a man of my sort walking about, who adored the very ground she trod upon. Chapter 12. A morning visitor. All through the night, waking and sleeping, and in my dreams, I wondered what Marjorie could see in him. In those same dreams, I satisfied myself that she could, and did, see nothing in him, but everything in me. Oh, the comfort. The misfortune was that when I awoke, I knew it was the other way round, so that it was a sad awakening, an awakening to thoughts of murder. So, swallowing a mouthful and a peg, I went into my laboratory to plan murder, legalized murder, on the biggest scale it ever has been planned. I was on the track of a weapon which would make war not only an affair of a single campaign, but of a single half hour. It would not want an army to work it either. Once let an individual, or two or three at most, in possession of my weapon that was to be, get within a mile or so of even the largest body of disciplined troops that ever yet a nation put into the field, and, poof, in about the time it takes you to say that they would be all dead men. If weapons of precision, which may be relied upon to slay, so are preservers of the peace, and the man is a fool who says that they are not, then I was within reach of the finest preserver of the peace imagination ever yet conceived. What a sublime thought to think that in the hollow of your own hand lies the life and death of nations, and it was almost in mine. I had in front of me some of the finest destructive agents you could wish to light upon. Carbon monoxide, chlorine trioxide, mercuric oxide, conine, potassamide, potassium carboxide, cyanogen. When Edwards entered, I was wearing a mask of my own invention, a thing that covered ears and head and everything, something like a diver's helmet. I was dealing with gases a sniff of which meant death. Only a few days before, unmasked, I had been doing some fool's trick with a couple of acids, sulfuric and cyanide of potassium, when somehow my hand slipped, and before I knew it, minute portions of them combined. By the mercy of Providence, I fell backwards instead of forwards. Sequel, about an hour afterwards, Edwards found me on the floor, and it took the remainder of that day, and most of the doctors in town, to bring me back to life again. Edwards announced his presence by touching me on the shoulder. When I'm wearing that mask, it isn't always easy to make me hear. "Someone wishes to see you, sir." "Then tell someone that I don't wish to see him." Well-trained servant, Edwards. He walked off with the message as decorously as you please, and then I thought there was an end. But there wasn't. I was regulating the valve of a cylinder in which I was fusing some oxides when, once more, someone touched me on the shoulder. Without turning, I took it for granted it was Edwards back again. "I have only to give a tiny twist to this tap, my good fellow, and you will be in the land where the bogies bloom. Why will you come where you're not wanted?" Then I looked round. Who the devil are you? For it was not Edwards at all, but quite a different class of character. I found myself confronting an individual who might almost have sat for one of the bogies I had just alluded to. His costume was reminiscent of the Algerians, whom one finds all over France, and who are the most persistent, insolent, and amusing of peddlers. I remember one who used to haunt the repetitions at the Alcazar at Tours. But this individual was like the originals, yet unlike. He was less gaudy and a good deal dingier than his Gallic prototypes are apt to be. Then he wore a burnous, the yellow, grimy-looking article of the Arab of the Sudan, not the spick-and-span Arab of the boulevard. Chief difference of all, his face was clean-shaven, and whoever saw an Algerian of Paris whose chiefest glory was not his well-trimmed moustache and beard. I expected that he would address me in the lingo which these gentlemen call French, but he didn't. "You are Mr. Atherton, and you are Mr. Who? How did you come here? Where's my servant?" The fellow held up his hand. As he did so, as if in accordance with a pre-arranged signal, Edwards came into the room looking excessively startled. I turned to him. "Is this the person who wished to see me?" "Yes, sir." "Didn't I tell you to say that I didn't wish to see him?" "Yes, sir." "Then why didn't you do as I told you?" "I did, sir." "Then how comes he here?" "Really, sir." Edwards put his hand up to his head as if he was half asleep. "I don't quite know." "What do you mean by you don't know? Why didn't you stop him?" "I think, sir, that I must have had a touch of sudden faintness because I tried to put out my hand to stop him, and I couldn't." "You're an idiot. Go." And he went. I turned to the stranger. "Pray, sir, are you a magician?" He replied to my question with another. "You, Mr. Atherton, are you also a magician?" He was staring at my mask with an evident lack of comprehension. "I wear this because, in this place, death lurks in so many subtle forms that without it I dare not breathe." He inclined his head, though I doubt if he understood. "Be so good as to tell me, briefly, what it is you wish with me." He slipped his hand into the folds of his burnous, and taking out a slip of paper, laid it on the shelf by which we were standing. I glanced at it, expecting to find on it a petition or a testimonial or a true statement of his sad case. Instead, it contained 2 words only: Marjorie Linden. The unlooked-for sight of that well-loved name brought the blood into my cheeks. "You come from Miss Linden?" He narrowed his shoulders, brought his fingertips together, inclined his head in a fashion which was peculiarly oriental, but not particularly explanatory. So I repeated my question. "Do you wish me to understand that you do come from Miss Linden?" Again he slipped his hand into his burnous. Again he produced a slip of paper. Again he laid it on the shelf. Again I glanced at it. Again nothing was written on it but a name: Paul Lessingham. "Well, I see. Paul Lessingham. What then? She is good, he is bad, is it not so?" He touched first one scrap of paper, then the other. I stared. "Pray, how do you happen to know?" "He shall never have her." "Eh? What on earth do you mean?" "Ah, what do I mean? Precisely what do you mean? And also, and at the same time, who the devil are you?" "It is as a friend I come to you." "Then in that case, you may go. I happen to be overstocked in that line just now." "Not with the kind of friend I am." "The saints forfend." "You love her. You love Miss Linden." Can you bear to think of him in her arms? I took off my mask, feeling that the occasion required it. As I did so, he brushed aside the hanging folds of the hood of his burnous, so that I saw more of his face. I was immediately conscious that in his eyes there was, in an especial degree, what, for want of a better term, one may call the mesmeric quality. That his was one of those morbid organisations which are oftener found, thank goodness, in the East than in the West, and which are apt to exercise an uncanny influence over the weak and the foolish folk with whom they come in contact. The kind of creature for whom it is always just as well to keep a seasoned rope close handy. I was, also, conscious that he was taking advantage of the removal of my mask to try his strength on me, than which he could not have found a tougher job. The sensitive something which is found in the hypnotic subject happens, in me, to be wholly absent. "I see you are a mesmerist," he started. "I am nothing, a shadow, and I'm a scientist. I should like, with your permission, or without it, to try an experiment or two on you." He moved further back. There came a gleam into his eyes which suggested that he possessed his hideous power to an unusual degree, that, in the estimation of his own people, he was qualified to take his standing as a regular devil doctor. "We will try experiments together, you and I, on Paul Lessingham." "Why on him?" "You do not know. I do not. Why do you lie to me?" "I don't lie to you. I haven't the faintest notion what is the nature of your interest in Mr. Lessingham." "My interest? That is another thing. It is your interest of which we are speaking." "Pardon me, it is yours. Listen, you love her, and he. But at a word from you he shall not have her. Never. It is I who say it. I. And once more, sir, who are you?" "I am of the children of Isis." "Is that so? It occurs to me that you have made a slight mistake. This is London, not a dog-hole in the desert." "Do I not know? What does it matter? You shall see. There will come a time when you will want me. You will find that you cannot bear to think of him in her arms, her whom you love. You will call to me, and I shall come, and of Paul Lessingham there shall be an end." While I was wondering whether he was really as mad as he sounded, or whether he was some impudent charlatan who had an axe of his own to grind, and thought that he had found in me a grindstone, he had vanished from the room. I moved after him. "Hang it all, stop!" I cried. He must have made pretty good travelling, because before I had a foot in the hall, I heard the front door slam, and when I reached the street, intent on calling him back, neither to the right nor to the left was there a sign of him to be seen. Chapter 13. The picture. I wonder what that nice-looking beggar really means, and who he happens to be. That was what I said to myself when I returned to the laboratory. If it is true that now and again Providence does write a man's character on his face, then there can't be the slightest shred of a doubt that a curious one's been written on his. I wonder what his connection has been with the apostle, or if it's only part of his game of bluff. I strode up and down. For the moment my interest in the experiments I was conducting had waned. If it was all bluff, I never saw a better piece of acting. And yet what sort of finger can such a precision as St. Paul have in such a pie? The fellow seemed to squirm at the mere mention of the rising hope of the radical's name. Can the objection be political? Let me consider. What has Lessingham done which could offend the religious or patriotic susceptibilities of the most fanatical of Orientals? Politically, I can recall nothing. Foreign affairs, as a rule, he is carefully eschewed. If he has offended, and if he hasn't, the seeming was uncommonly good, the cause will have to be sought upon some other track. But then, what track? The more I strove to puzzle it out, the greater the puzzlement grew. Absurd! The rascal has had no more connection with St. Paul than St. Peter. The probability is that he's a crackpot, and if he isn't, he has some little game on foot, in close association with the hunt of the youth bird, which he tried to work off on me, but couldn't. As for Marjorie, my Marjorie, only she isn't mine. Confound it. If I had had my senses about me, I should have broken his head in several places for daring to allow her name to pass his lips. The unbaptized Mohammedan. Now to return to the chase of splendid murder. I snatched up my mask, one of the most ingenious inventions, by the way, of recent years. If the armies of the future wear my mask, they will defy my weapon. And and was about to readjust it in its place when someone knocked at the door. "Who's there? Come in!" It was Edwards. He looked round him as if surprised. "I beg your pardon, sir. I thought you were engaged. I didn't know that. That gentleman had gone." He went up the chimney, as all that kind of gentlemen do. "Why the deuce did you let him in when I told you not to?" "Really, sir, I don't know. I gave him your message, and he looked at me, and that is all I remember till I found myself standing in this room." Had it not been Edwards, I might have suspected him of having had his palm well greased, but in his case, I knew better. It was as I thought. My visitor was a mesmerist of the first class. He had actually played some of his tricks in broad daylight on my servant at my own front door. A man worth studying. Edwards continued. "There is someone else, sir, who wishes to see you. Mr. Lessingham." Mr. Lessingham! At that moment the juxtaposition seemed odd, though I dare say it was so rather in appearance than in reality. "Show him in." Presently in came Paul. I'm free to confess, I've owned it before, that in a sense I admire that man, so long as he does not presume to thrust himself into a certain position. He possesses physical qualities which please my eye, speaking as a mere biologist. I like the suggestion conveyed by his every pose, his every movement of a tenacious hold on life, of reserve force, of a repository of bone and gristle on which he can fall back at pleasure. The fellow's lithe and active, not hasty yet agile, clean built, well hung, the sort of man who might be relied upon to make a good recovery. You might beat him in a sprint, mental or physical, though to do that you would have to be spry. But in a staying race, he would see you out. I do not know that he is exactly the kind of man whom I would trust, unless I knew that he was on the job, which knowledge, in his case, would be uncommonly hard to attain. He is too calm, too self-contained, with the knack of looking all round him even in moments of extremest peril, and for whatever he does, he has a good excuse. He has the reputation, both in the house and out of it, of being a man of iron nerve, and with some reason, yet I am not so sure. Unless I read him wrongly, his is one of those individualities which, confronted by certain eventualities, collapse, to rise, the moment of trial having passed, like Phoenix from her ashes. However it might be with his adherents, he would show no trace of his disaster. And this was the man whom Marjorie loved. Well, she could show some cause. He was a man of position, destined probably to rise much higher, a man of parts, with capacity to make the most of them, not ill-looking, with agreeable manners, when he chose, and he came within the lady's definition of a gentleman. He always did the right thing, at the right time, in the right way. And yet, well, I take it that we are all cads, and that we most of us are prigs. For mercy's sake, do not let us all give ourselves away. He was dressed as a gentleman should be dressed. Black frock coat, black vest, dark grey trousers, stand-up collar, smartly tied bow, gloves of the proper shade, neatly brushed hair, and a smile, which, if was not childlike, at any rate was bland. "I'm not disturbing you, not at all. Sure, I never enter a place like this, where a man is matching himself with nature, to wrest from her secrets, without feeling that I am crossing the threshold of the unknown. The last time I was in this room was just after you'd taken out the final patents for your system of telegraphy at sea, which the Admiralty purchased, wisely. What is it now? Death? No? Really? What do you mean? If you are a member of the next government, you will possibly learn. I may offer them the refusal of a new wrinkle in the art of murder. I see. A new projectile. How long is this race to continue between attack and defence? Until the sun grows cold. And then, there'll be no defence. Nothing to defend. He looked at me with his calm, grave eyes. The theory of the age of ice, towards which we are advancing, is not a cheerful one. He began to finger a glass retort which lay upon a table. By the way, it was very good of you to give me a look in last night. I'm afraid you thought me peremptory. I have come to apologise. I don't know that I thought you peremptory. I thought you queer. Yes. He glanced at me with that expressionless look upon his face which he could summon at will, and which is at the bottom of the superstition about his iron nerve. I was worried, and not well. Besides, one doesn't care to be burgled, even by a maniac. Was he a maniac? Did you see him? Very clearly. Where? In the street. How close were you to him? Closer than I am to you. Indeed, I didn't know you were so close to him as that. Did you try to stop him? Easier said than done. He was off at such a rate. Did you see how he was dressed, or rather, undressed? I did. In nothing but a cloak on such a night. Who but a lunatic would have attempted burglary in such a costume? Did he take anything? Absolutely nothing. It seems to have been a curious episode. He moved his eyebrows. According to members of the house, the only gesture in which he has been known to indulge. We become accustomed to curious episodes. Oblige me by not mentioning it to anyone. To anyone. He repeated the last two words, as if to give them emphasis. I wondered if he was thinking of Marjorie. I'm communicating with the police. Until they move, I don't want it to get into the papers, or to be talked about. It's a worry. You understand? I nodded. He changed the theme. This that you're engaged upon, is it a projectile or a weapon? If you are a member of the next government, you will possibly know. If you aren't, you possibly won't. I suppose you have to keep this sort of thing secret. I do. It seems that matters of much less moment you wish to keep secret. You mean that business of last night? If a trifle of that sort gets into the papers or gets talked about, which is the same thing, you have no notion how we are pestered. It becomes an almost unbearable nuisance. Jones the unknown can commit murder with less inconvenience to himself than Jones the notorious can have his pocket picked. There is not so much exaggeration in that as there sounds. Goodbye. Thanks for your promise. I'd given him no promise, but that was by the way. He turned as to go, then stopped. There's another thing. I believe you're a specialist on questions of ancient superstitions and extinct religions. I am interested in such subjects, but I am not a specialist. Can you tell me what were the exact tenets of the worshippers of Isis? Neither I, nor any man, with scientific certainty. As you know, she had a brother. The cult of Osiris and Isis was one and the same. What precisely were its dogmas, or its practices, or anything about it? None now can tell. The papyri, hieroglyphics, and so on, which remain are very far from being exhaustive, and our knowledge of those which do remain is still less so. I suppose that the marvels which are told of it are purely legendary. To what marvels do you particularly refer? Weren't supernatural powers attributed to the priests of Isis? Broadly speaking, at that time, supernatural powers were attributed to all the priests of all the creeds. I see, presently he continued. I presume that her cult is long since extinct, that none of the worshippers of Isis exist today. I hesitated. I was wondering why he had hit on such a subject. If he really had a reason, or if he was merely asking questions as a cover for something else. You see, I knew my Paul. That is not so sure. He looked at me with that passionless yet searching glance of his. You think that she still is worshipped? I think it possible, even probable, that here and there in Africa is a large order. Homage is paid to Isis, quite in the good old way. Do you know that as a fact? Excuse me, but do you know it as a fact? Are you aware that you are treating me as if I was on the witness stand? Have you any special purpose in making these inquiries? He smiled. In a kind of a way I have. I've recently come across rather a curious story. I'm trying to get to the bottom of it. What is the story? I'm afraid that at present I am not at liberty to tell it you. When I am, I will. You will find it interesting. As an instance of a singular survival. Didn't the followers of Isis believe in transmigration? Some of them, no doubt. What did they understand by transmigration? Transmigration? Yes, but of the soul or of the body? How do you mean? Transmigration is transmigration. Are you driving at something in particular? If you'll tell me fairly and squarely what it is, I'll do my best to give you the information you require. As it is, your questions are a bit perplexing. Oh, it doesn't matter. As you say, transmigration is transmigration. I was eyeing him keenly. I seemed to detect in his manner an odd reluctance to enlarge on the subject he himself had started. He continued to trifle with the retort upon the table. Hadn't the followers of Isis what shall I say, a sacred emblem? How? Hadn't they an especial regard for some sort of wasn't it some sort of a beetle? You mean Scarabaeus sacer, according to Latreille, Scarabaeus aegyptiorum. Undoubtedly, the scarab was venerated throughout Egypt. Indeed, speaking generally, most things that had life, for instance, cats. As you know, Orisis continued among men in the figure of Apis, the bull. Weren't the priests of Isis, or some of them, supposed to assume, after death, the form of a Scarabaeus? I never heard of it. Are you sure? Think. I shouldn't like to answer such a question positively, offhand, but I don't, on the spur of the moment, recall any supposition of the kind. Don't laugh at me. I'm not a lunatic, but I understand that recent researches have shown that even in some of the most astounding of the ancient legends, there was a substratum of fact. Is it absolutely certain that there could be no shred of truth in such a belief? In what belief? In the belief that a priest of Isis, or anyone, assumed after death the form of a Scarabaeus? It seems to me, Lessingham, that you have lately come across some uncommonly interesting data, of a kind too, which it is your bounden duty to give to the world, or, at any rate, to that portion of the world which is represented by me. Come, tell us all about it. What are you afraid of? I'm afraid of nothing, and someday you shall be told, but not now. At present, answer my question. Then repeat your question, clearly. Is it absolutely certain that there could be no foundation of truth in the belief that a priest of Isis, or anyone, assumed after death the form of a beetle? I know no more than the man in the moon. How the dickens should I? Such a belief may have been symbolical. Christians believe that after death the body takes the shape of worms, and so, in a sense, it does, and sometimes eels. That is not what I mean. Then what do you mean? Listen. If a person, of whose veracity there could not be a vestige of a doubt, assured you that he had seen such a transformation actually take place, could it conceivably be explained on natural grounds? Seen a priest of Isis assume the form of a beetle, or a follower of Isis, before or after death? He hesitated. I had seldom seen him wear such an appearance of interest. To be frank, I was keenly interested too, but on a sudden there came into his eyes a glint of something that was almost terror. When he spoke, it was with the most unwonted awkwardness. In the very act of dying, if he had seen a follower of Isis in the very act of dying assume the form of a beetle on any conceivable grounds, would such a transformation be susceptible of a natural explanation? I stared, as who would not? Such an extraordinary question was rendered more extraordinary by coming from such a man. Yet I was almost beginning to suspect that there was something behind it more extraordinary still. Look here, Lessingham. I can see you've a capital tale to tell. So tell it, man. Unless I'm mistaken, it's not the kind of tale in which ordinary scruples can have any part or parcel. Anyhow, it's hardly fair of you to set my curiosity all agog, and then to leave it unappeased. He eyed me steadily, the appearance of interest fading more and more, until presently his face assumed its wonted expressionless mask. Somehow, I was conscious that what he had seen in my face was not altogether to his liking. His voice was once more bland and self-contained. I perceive you're of opinion that I have been told a taradiddle. I suppose I have. But what is the taradiddle? Don't you see I'm burning? Unfortunately, Atherton, I am on my honour. Until I have permission to unloose it, my tongue is tied. He picked up his hat and umbrella from where he had placed them on the table. Holding them in his left hand, he advanced to me with his right outstretched. It is very good of you to suffer my continued interruption. I know, to my sorrow, what such interruptions mean. Believe me, I'm not ungrateful. What is this? On the shelf, within a foot or so of where I stood, was a sheet of paper, the size and shape of half a sheet of postnote. At this, he stooped to glance. As he did so, something surprising occurred. On the instant, a look came onto his face, which literally transfigured him. His hat and umbrella fell from his grasp onto the floor. He retreated, gibbering, his hands held out as if to ward something off from him, until he reached the wall on the other side of the room. A more amazing spectacle than he presented I never saw. "Lessingham!" I exclaimed. "What's wrong with you?" My first impression was that he was struck by a fit of epilepsy. though anyone less like an epileptic subject it would be hard to find. In my bewilderment, I looked round to see what could be the immediate cause. My eye fell upon the sheet of paper. I stared at it with considerable surprise. I had not noticed it there previously. I had not put it there. Where had it come from? The curious thing was that on it, produced apparently by some process of photogravure, was an illustration of a species of beetle with which I felt that I ought to be acquainted, and yet was not. It was of a dull golden green. The colour was so well brought out, even to the extent of seeming to scintillate, and the whole thing was so dexterously done that the creature seemed alive. The semblance of reality was, indeed, so vivid that it needed a second glance to be assured that it was a mere trick of the reproducer. Its presence there was odd. After what we had been talking about, it might seem to need explanation, but it was absurd to suppose that that alone could have had such an effect on a man like Lessingham. With the thing in my hand, I crossed to where he was. Pressing his back against the wall, he had shrunk lower inch by inch till he was actually crouching on his haunches. "Lessingham, come man, what's wrong with you?" Taking him by the shoulder, I shook him with some vigour. My touch had on him the effect of seeming to wake him out of a dream, of restoring him to consciousness as against the nightmare horrors with which he was struggling. He gazed up at me with that look of cunning on his face which one associates with abject terror. "Atherton, is it you? It's all right, quite right. I'm well, very well." As he spoke, he slowly drew himself up, till he was standing erect. "Then in that case, all I can say is that you have a queer way of being very well." He put his hand up to his mouth, as if to hide the trembling of his lips. "It's the pressure of overwork. I've had 1 or 2 attacks like this, but it's nothing, only a local lesion." I observed him keenly. To my thinking, there was something about him which was very odd indeed. Only a local lesion. If you take my strongly urged advice, you'll get a medical opinion without delay, if you haven't been wise enough to have done so already. I'll go today, at once, but I know it's only mental overstrain. You're sure it's nothing to do with this? I held out in front of him the photogravure of the beetle. As I did so, he backed away from me, shrieking, trembling as with palsy. "Take it away! Take it away!" he screamed. I stared at him for some seconds, astonished into speechlessness. Then I found my tongue. "Lessingham, it's only a picture. Are you stark mad?" He persisted in his exclamations. "Take it away! Take it away! Tear it up! Burn it!" His agitation was so unnatural, from whatever cause it arose, that fearing the recurrence of the attack from which he had just recovered, I did as he bade me. I tore the sheet of paper into quarters and, striking a match, set fire to each separate piece. He watched the process of incineration as if fascinated. When it was concluded, and nothing but ashes remained, he gave a gasp of relief. "Lessingham," I said, "you're either mad already or you're going mad. Which is it?" "I think it's neither. I believe I am as sane as you. It's that story of which I was speaking. It seems curious, but I'll tell you all about it some day. As I observed, I think you will find it an interesting instance of a singular survival." He made an obvious effort to become more like his usual self. "It is extremely unfortunate, Atherton, that I should have troubled you with such a display of weakness, especially as I'm able to offer you so scant an explanation. One thing I would ask of you, to observe strict confidence. What has taken place has been between ourselves. I am in your hands, but you are my friend. I know I can rely on you not to speak of it to anyone, and in particular, not to breathe a hint of it to Miss Linden. Why, in particular, not to Miss Linden. Can you not guess?" I hunched my shoulder. "If what I guess is what you mean, is not that a cause, the more why silence would be unfair to her. It is for me to speak, if for anyone. I shall not fail to do what should be done. Give me your promise that you will not hint a word to her of what you have so unfortunately seen." I gave him the promise he required. There was no more work for me that day. The apostle, his divagations, his example of the coleoptera, his Arabian friend, these things were as microbes which, acting on a system already predisposed for their reception, produced high fever. I was in a fever of unrest, brain in a whirl. Marjorie, Paul, Isis, Beetle, mesmerism in delirious jumble. Love's upsetting, in itself a sufficiently severe disease. But when complications intervene, suggestive of mystery and novelties, so that you do not know if you're moving in an atmosphere of dreams or of frozen facts, if then your temperature does not rise, like that rocket of Monsieur Verne's, which reached the moon, then you are a freak of an entirely genuine kind. And if the surgeons do not preserve you and place you on view, in pickle, they ought to, for the sake of historical doubters, for no one will believe that there ever was a man like you, unless you yourself are somewhere around to prove them Thomases. Myself, I am not that kind of man. When I get warm, I grow heated, and when I am heated, there is likely to be a variety show of a gaudy kind. When Paul had gone, I tried to think things out, and if I had kept on trying, something would have happened. So I went on the river instead. Chapter 14. The Duchess' Ball. That night was the Duchess of Datchet's ball. The first person I saw as I entered the dancing room was Dora Grayling. I went straight up to her. "Miss Grayling, I behaved very badly to you last night. I have come to make to you my apologies, to sue for your forgiveness." "My forgiveness?" Her head went back. She has a pretty bird-like trick of cocking it a little on one side. "You were not well. Are you better?" "Quite. You forgive me? Then grant me plenary absolution by giving me a dance for the one I lost last night." She rose. A man came up, a stranger to me. "She's one of the best hunted women in England. There's a million with her. This is my dance, Miss Grayling." She looked at him. "You must excuse me. I'm afraid I have made a mistake. I had forgotten that I was already engaged." I had not thought her capable of it. She took my arm, and away we went, and left him staring. "It's he who's the sufferer now," I whispered, as we went round. "She can waltz." "You think so? It was I last night. I did not mean, if I could help it, to suffer again. To me, a dance with you means something." She went all red, adding, as an afterthought, "Nowadays so few men really dance. I expect it's because you dance so well." "Thank you." We danced the waltz right through. Then we went to an impromptu shelter which had been rigged up on a balcony, and we talked. There's something sympathetic about Miss Grayling which leads one to talk about oneself. Before I was half aware of it, I was telling her of all my plans and projects, actually telling her of my latest notion, which, ultimately, was to result in the destruction of whole armies as by a flash of lightning. She took an amount of interest in it, which was surprising. What really stands in the way of things of this sort is not theory but practice. One can prove one's facts on paper, or on a small scale in a room. What is wanted is proof on a large scale, by actual experiment. If, for instance, I could take my plant to one of the forests of South America, where there is plenty of animal life, but no human, I could demonstrate the soundness of my position then and there. Why don't you? Think of the money it would cost. I thought I was a friend of yours. I had hoped you were. Then why don't you let me help you? Help me? How? By letting you have the money for your South American experiment. It would be an investment on which I should expect to receive good interest. I fidgeted. "It is very good of you, Miss Grayling, to talk like that." She became quite frigid. "Please don't be absurd. I perceive quite clearly that you are snubbing me, and that you are trying to do it as delicately as you know how. Miss Grayling, I understand that it was an impertinence on my part to volunteer assistance, which was unasked. You have made that sufficiently plain. I assure you, pray don't. Of course, if it had been Miss Linden, it would have been different. She would at least have received a civil answer. But we are not all Miss Linden." I was aghast. The outburst was so uncalled for. I had not the faintest notion what I had said or done to cause it. She was in such a surprising passion, and it suited her. I thought I had never seen her look prettier. I could do nothing else but stare. So she went on, with just as little reason. "Here is someone coming to claim this dance. I can't throw all my partners over. Have I offended you so irremediably that it will be impossible for you to dance with me again? Miss Grayling, I shall be only too delighted." She handed me her card. "Which may I have? For your own sake, you had better place it as far off as you possibly can. They all seem taken." "That doesn't matter. Strike off any name you please anywhere and put your own instead." It was giving me an almost embarrassingly free hand. I booked myself for the next waltz, but who it was who would have to give way to me I did not trouble to inquire. "Mr. Atherton, is that you?" It was. It was also she. It was Marjorie, and so soon as I saw her, I knew that there was only one woman in the world for me. The mere sight of her sent the blood tingling through my veins. Turning to her attendant cavalier, she dismissed him with a bow. "Is there an empty chair?" She seated herself in the one Miss Grayling had just vacated. I sat down beside her. She glanced at me, laughter in her eyes. I was all in a stupid tremblement. "You remember that last night I told you that I might require your friendly services in diplomatic intervention?" I nodded. I felt that the allusion was unfair. "Well, the occasion's come, or at least it's very near." She was still, and I said nothing to help her. "You know how unreasonable Papa can be." I did. Never a more pig-headed man in England than Geoffrey Linden, or in a sense, a duller. But just then, I was not prepared to admit it to his child. "You know what an absurd objection he has to Paul." There was an appreciative hesitation before she uttered the fellow's Christian name. When it came, it was with an accent of tenderness which stung me like a gadfly. To speak to me, of all men, of the fellow in such a tone was like a woman. "Has Mr. Linden no notion of how things stand between you? Except what he suspects. That is just where you are to come in. Papa thinks so much of you. I want you to sound Paul's praises in his ear, to prepare him for what must come." Was ever rejected lover burdened with such a task? Its enormity kept me still. "Sidney, you have always been my friend, my truest, dearest friend. When I was a little girl, you used to come between Papa and me, to shield me from his wrath. Now that I am a big girl, I want you to be on my side once more and to shield me still." Her voice softened. She laid her hand upon my arm. How, under her touch, I burned. "But I don't understand what cause there has been for secrecy. Why should there have been any secrecy from the first? It was Paul's wish that Papa should not be told. Is Mr. Lessingham ashamed of you, Sidney, or does he fear your father? You are unkind. You know perfectly well that Papa has been prejudiced against him all along. You know that his political position is just now one of the greatest difficulty, that every nerve and muscle is kept on the continual strain, that it is in the highest degree essential that further complications of every and any sort should be avoided. He is quite aware that his suit will not be approved of by Papa, and he simply wishes that nothing shall be said about it till the end of the session. That is all." "I see. Mr. Lessingham is cautious even in love-making. Politician first, and lover afterwards. Well, why not? Would you have him injure the cause he has at heart for want of a little patience?" "It depends what cause it is he has at heart." "What is the matter with you? Why do you speak to me like that? It is not like you at all." She looked at me shrewdly, with flashing eyes. "Is it possible that you are jealous? That you were in earnest in what you said last night? I thought that was the sort of thing you said to every girl." I would have given a great deal to take her in my arms and press her to my bosom then and there. To think that she should taunt me with having said to her the sort of thing I said to every girl. What do you know of Mr. Lessingham? What all the world knows, that history will be made by him. There are kinds of history in the making, of which one would not desire to be associated. What do you know of his private life? It was to that I was referring. Really, you go too far. I know that he is one of the best, just as he is one of the greatest of men. For me, that is sufficient. If you do know that, it is sufficient. I do know it. All the world knows it. Everyone with whom he comes in contact is aware, must be aware, that he is incapable of a dishonourable thought or action. Take my advice. Don't appreciate any man too highly. In the book of every man's life, there is a page which he would wish to keep turned down. There is no such page in Paul's. There may be in yours. I think that probable. Thank you. I fear it is more than probable. I fear that in my case, the page may extend to several. There is nothing apostolic about me, not even the name. Sidney, you are unendurable. It is the more strange to hear you talk like this since Paul regards you as his friend. He flatters me. Are you not his friend? Is it not sufficient to be yours? No, who is against Paul is against me. That is hard. How is it hard? Who is against the husband can hardly be for the wife, when the husband and the wife are one. But as yet you are not one. Is my cause so hopeless? What do you call your cause? Are you thinking of that nonsense you were talking about last night? She laughed. You call it nonsense. You ask for sympathy and give so much. I will give you all the sympathy you stand in need of. I promise it. My poor dear Sydney, don't be so absurd. Do you think that I don't know you? You're the best of friends and the worst of lovers. As the one, so true, so fickle as the other. To my certain knowledge, with how many girls have you been in love and out again? It is true that, to the best of my knowledge and belief, you have never been in love with me before. But that's the merest accident. Believe me, my dear, dear Sydney, you'll be in love with someone else tomorrow, if you're not halfway there tonight. I confess quite frankly that in that direction, all the experience I have had of you has in no wise strengthened my prophetic instinct. Cheer up, one never knows. Who is this that's coming? It was Dora Grayling who was coming. I went off with her without a word. We were halfway through the dance before she spoke to me. I'm sorry that I was cross to you just now, and disagreeable. Somehow I always seem destined to show to you my most unpleasant side. The blame was mine. What sort of side do I show you? You are far kinder to me than I deserve, now and always. That is what you say. Pardon me, it's true. Else how comes it that at this time of day I'm without a friend in all the world? You, without a friend? I never knew a man who had so many. I never knew a person of whom so many men and women join in speaking well. Miss Grayling, as for never having done anything worth doing, think of what you have done. Think of your discoveries. Think of your inventions. Think of, but never mind. The world knows you have done great things, and it confidently looks to you to do still greater. You talk of being friendless, and yet when I ask as a favour, as a great favour, to be allowed to do something to show my friendship, you snub me. I snub you. You know you snubbed me. Do you really mean that you take an interest in my work? You know I mean it. She turned to me, her face all glowing, and I did know it. Will you come to my laboratory tomorrow morning? Will I? Won't I? With your aunt? Yes, with my aunt. I'll show you round and tell you all there is to be told, and then if you still think there's anything in it, I'll accept your offer about that South American experiment. That is, if it still holds good. Of course it still holds good. And we'll be partners. Partners? Yes, we will be partners. It will cost a terrific sum. There are some things which never can cost too much. That's not my experience. I hope it will be mine. It's a bargain? On my side, I promise you that it's a bargain. When I got outside the room, I found that Percy Woodville was at my side. His round face was, in a manner of speaking, as long as my arm. He took his glass out of his eye and rubbed it with his handkerchief. And directly he put it back, he took it out and rubbed it again. I believe that I never saw him in such a state of fluster. And when one speaks of Woodville, that means something. Atherton, I'm in a devil of a stew. He looked it. All of a heap. I've had a blow which I shall never get over. Then get under. Woodville is one of those fellows who will insist on telling me their most private matters, even to what they owe their washerwomen for the ruination of their shirts. Why, goodness alone can tell. Heaven knows I'm not sympathetic. Don't be an idiot. You don't know what I'm suffering. I'm as nearly as possible stark mad. That's all right, old chap. I've seen you that way more than once before. Don't talk like that. You're not a perfect brute. I bet you a shilling that I am. Don't torture me. You're not. Atherton. He seized me by the lapels of my coat, seeming half beside himself. Fortunately, he had drawn me into a recess, so that we were noticed by few observers. What do you think has happened? My dear chap, how on earth am I to know? She's refused me. Has she? Well, I never. Buck up. Try some other address. There are quite as good fish in the sea as ever came out of it. Atherton, you're a blackguard. He had crumpled his handkerchief into a ball and was actually bobbing at his eyes with it. The idea of Percy Woodville being dissolved in tears was excruciatingly funny, but just then I could hardly tell him so. There's not a doubt of it. It's my way of being sympathetic. Don't be so down, man. Try her again. It's not the slightest use, I know it isn't, from the way she treated me. Don't be so sure. Women often say what they mean least. Who's the lady? Who? Is there more women in the world than one for me? Or has there ever been? You ask me who. What does the word mean to me but Marjorie Linden? Marjorie Linden. I fancy that my jaw dropped open. That, to use his own vernacular, I was all of a heap. I felt like it. I strode away, leaving him mazed, and all but ran into Marjorie's arms. I'm just leaving. Will you see me to the carriage, Mr. Atherton? I saw her to the carriage. Are you off? Can I give you a lift? Thank you. I'm not thinking of being off. I'm going to the House of Commons. Won't you come? What are you going there for? Directly she spoke of it, I knew why she was going, and she knew that I knew, as her words showed. You are quite well aware of what the magnet is. You are not so ignorant as not to know that the Agricultural Amendment Act is on tonight, and that Paul is to speak. I always try to be there when Paul is to speak, and I mean to always keep on trying. He is a fortunate man, indeed, and again indeed. A man with such gifts as his is inadequately described as fortunate. But I must be off. He expected to be up before, but I heard from him a few minutes ago that there has been a delay, but that he will be up within half an hour, till our next meeting. As I returned into the house, in the hall I met Percy Woodville. He had his hat on. Where are you off to? I'm off to the house. To hear Paul Lessingham? Damn Paul Lessingham. With all my heart. There's a division expected. I've got to go. Someone else has gone to hear Paul Lessingham. Marjorie Linden. No, you don't say so. By Jove. I say, Atherton, I wish I could make a speech. I never can. When I'm electioneering, I have to have my speeches written for me, and then I have to read them. But by Jove, if I knew Miss Linden was in the gallery, and if I knew anything about the thing, or could get someone to tell me something, hang me if I wouldn't speak. I'd show her I'm not the fool she thinks I am. Speak, Percy, speak. You'd knock 'em silly, sir. I tell you what I'll do. I'll come with you. I'll to the house as well. Paul Lessingham shall have an audience of 3. Chapter 15. Mr. Lessingham speaks. The house was full. Percy and I went upstairs, to the gallery, which is theoretically supposed to be reserved for what are called distinguished strangers, those curious animals. Trumpeton was up, hammering out those sentences which smell not so much of the lamp as of the dunderhead. Nobody was listening, except the men in the press gallery. Where is the brain of the house, and 90% of its wisdom? It was not till Trumpeton had finished that I discovered Lessingham. The tedious ancient resumed his seat amidst a murmur of sounds, which, I have no doubt, some of the pressmen interpreted next day as aloud and continued applause. There was movement in the house, possibly expressive of relief. A hum of voices, men came flocking in. Then, from the opposition benches, there rose a sound which was applause, and I perceived that, on a cross-bench close to the gangway, Paul Lessingham was standing up bareheaded. I eyed him critically, as a collector might eye a valuable specimen, or a pathologist a curious subject. During the last 24 hours, my interest in him had grown apace. Just then, to me, he was the most interesting man the world contained. When I remembered how I had seen him that same morning, a nerveless, terror-stricken wretch, grovelling like some craven cur, upon the floor, frightened to the verge of imbecility by a shadow and less than a shadow, I was confronted by 2 hypotheses. Either I had exaggerated his condition then, or I exaggerated his condition now. So far as appearance went, it was incredible that this man could be that one. I confess that my feeling rapidly became one of admiration. I loved the fighter. I quickly recognized that here we had him in perfection. There was no seeming about him then. The man was to the manner born, to his fingertips a fighting man. I had never realized it so clearly before. He was coolness itself. He had all his faculties under complete command, while never, for a moment, really exposing himself. He would be swift in perceiving the slightest weakness in his opponent's defense, and, so soon as he saw it, like lightning, he would slip in a telling blow. Though defeated, he would hardly be disgraced, and one might easily believe that their very victories would be so expensive to his assailants that, in the end, they would actually conduce to his own triumph. Hang me, I told myself, if, after all, I'm surprised if Marjorie does see something in him, for I perceived how a clever and imaginative young woman, seeing him at his best, holding his own, like a gallant knight against overwhelming odds in the lists in which he was so much at home, might come to think of him as if he were always and only there, ignoring altogether the kind of man he was when the joust was finished. It did me good to hear him, I do know that. And I could easily imagine the effect he had on one particular auditor who was in the lady's cage. It was very far from being an oration in the American sense. It had little or nothing of the fire and fury of the French tribune. It was marked neither by the ponderosity nor the sentiment of the eloquent German, yet it was as satisfying as are the efforts of either of the three, producing, without doubt, precisely the effect which the speaker intended. His voice was clear and calm, not exactly musical, yet distinctly pleasant, and it was so managed that each word he uttered was as audible to every person present as if it had been addressed particularly to him. His sentences were short and crisp. The words which he used were not big ones, but they came from him with an agreeable ease, and he spoke just fast enough to keep one's interest alert, without involving a strain on the attention. He commenced by making, in the quietest and most courteous manner, sarcastic comments on the speeches and methods of Trumpeton and his friends, which tickled the house amazingly. But he did not make the mistake of pushing his personalities too far. To a speaker of a certain sort, nothing is easier than to sting to madness if he likes. His every word is barbed. Wounds so given fester, they are not easily forgiven. It is essential to a politician that he should have his firmest friends among the fools, or his climbing days will soon be over. Soon his sarcasms were at an end. He began to exchange them for sweet-sounding phrases. He actually began to say pleasant things to his opponents, apparently to mean them, to put them in a good conceit with themselves. He pointed out how much truth there was in what they said, and then, as if by accident, with what ease and at how little cost, amendments might be made. He found their arguments, and took them for his own, and flattered them, whether they would or would not, by showing how firmly they were founded upon fact, and grafted other arguments upon them, which seemed their natural sequelae, and transformed them, and drove them hither and thither, and brought them, their own arguments, to a round, irrefragable conclusion, which was diametrically the reverse of that to which they themselves had brought them. And he did it all with an aptness, a readiness, a grace, which was incontestable, so that when he sat down, he had performed that most difficult of all feats. He had delivered what, in a House of Commons sense, was a practical, statesmanlike speech, and yet one which left his hearers in an excellent humour. It was a great success, an immense success, a parliamentary triumph of almost the highest order. Paul Lessingham had been coming on by leaps and bounds when he resumed his seat, amidst applause, which, this time, really was applause. There were, probably, few who doubted that he was destined to go still farther. How much farther, it is true, that time alone could tell. But so far as appearances went, all the prizes, which are as the crown and climax of a statesman's career, were well within his reach. For my part, I was delighted. I had enjoyed an intellectual exercise, a species of enjoyment not so common as it might be. The apostle had almost persuaded me that the political game was one worth playing, and that its triumphs were things to be desired. It is something, after all, to be able to appeal successfully to the passions and aspirations of your peers, to gain their plaudits, to prove your skill at the game you yourself have chosen, to be looked up to and admired. And when a woman's eyes look down on you, and her ears drink in your every word, and her heart beats time with yours, each man to his own temperament, but when that woman is the woman whom you love, to know that your triumph means her glory, and her gladness, to me, that would be the best part of it all. In that hour, the apostle's hour, I almost wished that I were a politician too. The division was over. The business of the night was practically done. I was back again in the lobby. The theme of conversation was the apostle's speech. On every side they talked of it. Suddenly Marjorie was at my side. Her face was glowing. I never saw her look more beautiful or happier. She seemed to be alone. "So you have come, after all. Wasn't it splendid? Wasn't it magnificent? Isn't it grand to have such great gifts? and to use them to such good purpose. Speak, Sydney. Don't feign a coolness which is foreign to your nature." I saw that she was hungry for me to praise the man whom she delighted to honour, but somehow her enthusiasm cooled mine. It was not a bad speech of a kind. How her eyes flashed fire. With what disdain she treated me. What do you mean by "of a kind"? My dear Sydney, are you not aware that it is an attribute of small minds to attempt to belittle those which are greater? Even if you are conscious of inferiority, it's unwise to show it. Mr. Lessingham's was a great speech of any kind. Your incapacity to recognise the fact simply reveals your lack of the critical faculty. It is fortunate for Mr. Lessingham that there is at least one person in whom the critical faculty is so bountifully developed. Apparently, in your judgment, he who discriminates is lost. I thought she was going to burst into passion, but instead, laughing, she placed her hand upon my shoulder. Poor Sydney, I understand. It is so sad. Do you know you are like a little boy who, when he is beaten, declares that the victor has cheated him? Never mind. As you grow older, you will learn better. She stung me almost beyond bearing. I cared not what I said. You, unless I am mistaken, will learn better before you are older. What do you mean? Before I could have told her, if I had meant to tell, which I did not, Lessingham came up. I hope I have not kept you waiting. I have been delayed longer than I expected. Not at all, though I am quite ready to get away. It's a little tiresome waiting here. This with a mischievous glance towards me, a glance which compelled Lessingham to notice me. You do not often favour us. I don't. I find better employment for my time. You are wrong. It's the cant of the day to underrate the House of Commons and the work which it performs. Don't you suffer yourself to join in the chorus of the simpletons. Your time cannot be better employed than in endeavouring to improve the body politic. I'm obliged to you. I hope you are feeling better than when I saw you last. A gleam came into his eyes, fading as quickly as it came. He showed no other sign of comprehension, surprise, or resentment. Thank you. I am very well. But Marjorie perceived that I meant more than met the eye, and that what I meant was meant unpleasantly. Come, let us be off. It is Mr. Atherton tonight who is not well. She had just slipped her arm through Lessingham's when her father approached. Old Lyndon stared at her on the Apostle's arm, as if he could hardly believe that it was she. I thought that you were at the Duchess. So I have been, Papa, and now I'm here. Here! Old Lyndon began to stutter and stammer, and to grow red in the face, as is his wont when at all excited. What do you mean by here? Where's the carriage? Where should it be, except waiting for me outside, unless the horses have run away? I'll take you down to it. I don't approve of your waiting in a place like this. Thank you, Papa, but Mr. Lessingham is going to take me down. I shall see you afterwards. Goodbye. Anything cooler than the way in which she walked off I do not think I ever saw. This is the age of feminine advancement. Young women think nothing of twisting their mothers round their fingers, let alone their fathers. But the fashion in which that young woman walked off, on the Apostle's arm, and left her father standing there, was in its way a study. Lyndon seemed scarcely able to realise that the pair of them had gone. Even after they had disappeared in the crowd, he stood staring after them, growing redder and redder till the veins stood out upon his face, and I thought that an apoplectic seizure threatened. Then, with a gasp, he turned to me. Damned scoundrel! I took it for granted that he alluded to the gentleman, even though his following words hardly suggested it. Only this morning I forbade her to have anything to do with him, and now he's walked off with her. See, confounded adventurer. That's what he is, an adventurer, and before many hours have passed, I'll take the liberty to tell him so. Jamming his fists into his pockets, and puffing like a grampus in distress, he took himself away, and it was time he did, for his words were as audible as they were pointed, and already people were wondering what the matter was. Woodville came up as Lyndon was going, just as sorely distressed as ever. She went away with Lessingham. Did you see her? Of course I saw her. When a man makes a speech like Lessingham's, any girl would go away with him, and be proud to. When you are endowed with such great powers as he is, and use them for such lofty purposes, she'll walk away with you. But till then, never. He was at his old trick of polishing his eyeglass. It's bitter hard. When I knew that she was there, I'd half a mind to make a speech myself. Upon my word I had, only I didn't know what to speak about. And I can't speak anyhow. How can a fellow speak when he's shoved into the gallery? As you say, how can he? He can't stand on the railing and shout, even with a friend holding him behind. I know I shall speak one day, bound to, and then she won't be there. It'll be better for you if she isn't. Think so. Perhaps you're right. I'd be safe to make a mess of it, and then, if she were to see me at it, it'd be the devil. 'Pon my word, I've been wishing lately I was clever. He rubbed his nose with the rim of his eyeglass, looking the most comically disconsolate figure. Put black care behind you, Percy. Buck up, my boy. The division's over. You are free. Now we'll go on the fly. And we did go on the fly. Chapter 16. Atherton's Magic Vapour. I bore him off to supper at the Helicon. All the way in the cab, he was trying to tell me the story of how he proposed to Marjorie, and he was very far from being through with it when we reached the club. There was the usual crowd of supperites, but we got a little table to ourselves in a corner of the room, and before anything was brought for us to eat, he was at it again. A good many of the people were pretty near to shouting, and as they seemed to be all speaking at once, and the band was playing, and as the Helicon supper band is not piano, Percy did not have it quite all to himself. But, considering the delicacy of his subject, he talked as loudly as was decent, getting more so as he went on. But Percy is peculiar. I don't know how many times I've tried to tell her, over and over again. Have you now? Yes, pretty near every time I met her. But I never seem to get quite to it, don't you know? How was that? Why, just as I was going to say, Miss Linden, may I offer you the gift of my affection? Was that how you invariably intended to begin? Well, not always. One time like that, another time another way. Fact is, I got off a little speech by heart, but I never got a chance to reel it off, so I made up my mind to just say anything. And what did you say? Well, nothing. You see, I never got there. Just as I was feeling my way, she'd asked me if I preferred big sleeves to little ones, or top hats to billycocks, or some nonsense of the kind. Would she now? Yes. Of course I had to answer, and by the time I'd answered, the chance was lost. Percy was polishing his eyeglass. I tried to get there so many times, and she choked me off so often that I can't help thinking that she suspected what it was that I was after. You think she did? She must have done. Once I followed her down Piccadilly and chivied her into a glove shop in the Burlington Arcade. I meant to propose to her in there. I hadn't had a wink of sleep all night through dreaming of her, and I was just about desperate. And did you propose? The girl behind the counter made me buy a dozen pairs of gloves instead. They turned out to be 3 sizes too large for me when they came home. I believe she thought I'd gone to spoon the glove girl. She went out and left me there. That girl loaded me with all sorts of things when she was gone. I couldn't get away. She held me with her blessed eye. I believe it was a glass one. Miss Linden's? Or the glove girl's? The glove girl's. She sent me home a whole cartload of green ties and declared I'd ordered them. I shall never forget that day. I've never been up the arcade since, and never mean to. You gave Miss Linden a wrong impression. I don't know. I was always giving her wrong impressions. Once she said that she knew I was not a marrying man, that I was the sort of chap who never would marry, because she saw it in my face. Under the circumstances, that was trying. Bitter hard. Percy sighed again. I shouldn't mind if I wasn't so gone. I'm not a fellow who does get gone, but when I do get gone, I get so beastly gone. I tell you what, Percy, have a drink. I'm a teetotaler, you know I am. You talk of your heart being broken, and of your being a teetotaler in the same breath. If your heart were really broken, you'd throw teetotalism to the winds. Do you think so? Why? Because you would. Men whose hearts are broken always do. You'd swallow a magnum at the least. Percy groaned. When I drink, I'm always ill, but I'll have a try. He had a try, making a good beginning by emptying at a draught the glass which the waiter had just now filled. Then he relapsed into melancholy. Tell me, Percy, honest Indian, do you really love her? Love her? His eyes grew round as saucers. Don't I tell you that I love her? I know you tell me, but that sort of thing is easy telling. What does it make you feel like, this love you talk so much about? Feel like? Just anyhow, and know how. You should look inside me and then you'd know. I see. It's like that, is it? Suppose she loved another man. What sort of feeling would you feel towards him? Does she love another man? I say, suppose. I dare say she does. I expect that's it. What an idiot I am not to have thought of that before. He sighed and refilled his glass. He's a lucky chap, whoever he is. I'd like to tell him so. You'd like to tell him so? He's such a jolly lucky chap, you know. Possibly, but his jolly good luck is your jolly bad luck. Would you be willing to resign her to him without a word? If she loves him, but you say you love her. Of course I do. Well then, you don't suppose that, because I love her, I shouldn't like to see her happy. I'm not such a beast. I'd sooner see her happy than anything else in all the world. I see, even happy with another. I'm afraid that my philosophy is not like yours. If I loved Miss Linden, and she loved, say, Jones, I'm afraid I shouldn't feel like that towards Jones at all. What would you feel like? Murder. Percy, you come home with me. We've begun the night together. Let's end it together. And I'll show you one of the finest notions for committing murder on a scale of real magnificence you ever dreamed of. I should like to make use of it to show my feelings towards the supposititious Jones. He'd know what I felt for him when once he had been introduced to it. Percy went with me without a word. He had not had much to drink, but it had been too much for him, and he was in a condition of maundering sentimentality. I got him into a cab. We dashed along Piccadilly. He was silent and sat looking in front of him with an air of vacuous sullenness which ill became his cast of countenance. I bade the cabman pass through Lowndes Square. As we passed the Apostles, I pulled him up. I pointed out the place to Woodville. You see, Percy, that's Lessingham's house. That's the house of the man who went away with Marjorie. Yes. Words came from him slowly, with a quite unnecessary stress on each. Because he made a speech. I'd like to make a speech. One day I'll make a speech. Because he made a speech. Only that, and nothing more. When a man speaks with an apostle's tongue, he can witch any woman in the land. Hello, who's that? Lessingham, is that you? I saw, or thought I saw, someone, or something, glide up the steps and withdraw into the shadow of the doorway, as if unwilling to be seen. When I hailed, no one answered. I called again. Don't be shy, my friend. I sprang out of the cab, ran across the pavement and up the steps. To my surprise, there was no one in the doorway. It seemed incredible, but the place was empty. I felt about me with my hands, as if I had been playing at blind man's buff and grasped at vacancy. I came down a step or two. Ostensibly, there's a vacuum, which nature abhors. I say, driver, didn't you see someone come up the steps? I thought I did, sir. I could have sworn I did. So could I. It's very odd. Perhaps whoever it was has gone into the house, sir. I don't see how. We should have heard the door open if we hadn't seen it. And we should have seen it. It's not so dark as that. I've half a mind to ring the bell and inquire. I shouldn't do that if I was you, sir. You jump in and I'll get along. This is Mr. Lessingham's, the great Mr. Lessingham's. I believe the cabman thought that I was drunk and not respectable enough to claim acquaintance with the great Mr. Lessingham. Wake up, Woodville. Do you know I believe there's some mystery about this place? I feel assured of it. I feel as if I were in the presence of something uncanny, something which I can neither see, nor touch, nor hear. The cabman bent down from his seat, wheedling me. Jump in, sir, and we'll be getting along. I jumped in, and we got along, but not far. Before we had gone a dozen yards, I was out again, without troubling the driver to stop. He pulled up, aggrieved. Well, sir, what's the matter now? You'll be damaging yourself before you've done, and then you'll be blaming me. I had caught sight of a cat crouching in the shadow of the railings. A black one. That cat was my quarry. Either the creature was unusually sleepy, or slow, or stupid, or it had lost its wits, which a cat seldom does lose. Anyhow, without making an attempt to escape, it allowed me to grab it by the nape of the neck. So soon as we were inside my laboratory, I put the cat into my glass box. Percy stared. What have you put it there for? That, my dear Percy, is what you are shortly about to see. You are about to be the witness of an experiment which, to a legislator, such as you are, ought to be of the greatest possible interest. I am going to demonstrate, on a small scale, the action of the force which, on a large scale, I propose to employ on behalf of my native land. He showed no signs of being interested. Sinking into a chair, he recommenced his wearisome reiteration. I hate cats. Do let it go. I'm always miserable when there's a cat in the room. Nonsense. That's your fancy. What you want's a taste of whiskey. You'll be as chirpy as a cricket. I don't want anything more to drink. I've had too much already. I paid no heed to what he said. I poured 2 stiff doses into a couple of tumblers. Without seeming to be aware of what it was that he was doing, he disposed of the better half of the one I gave him at a draught. Putting his glass upon the table, he dropped his head upon his hands and groaned. What would Marjorie think of me if she saw me now? Think? Nothing. Why should she think of a man like you when she has so much better fish to fry? I'm feeling frightfully ill. I'll be drunk before I've done. Then be drunk. Only, for gracious sake, be lively drunk, not deadly doleful. Cheer up, Percy. I clapped him on the shoulder, almost knocking him off his seat onto the floor. I'm now going to show you that little experiment of which I was speaking. You see that cat? Of course I see it. The beast. I wish you'd let it go. Why should I let it go? Do you know whose cat that is? That cat's Paul Lessingham's. Paul Lessingham's. Yes, Paul Lessingham's. The man who made the speech. The man whom Marjorie went away with. How do you know it's his? I don't know it is, but I believe it is. I choose to believe it is. I intend to believe it is. It was outside his house, therefore it's his cat. That's how I argue. I can't get Lessingham inside that box, so I get his cat instead. Whatever for? You shall see. You observe how happy it is? It don't seem happy. We've all our ways of seeming happy. That's its way. The creature was behaving like a cat gone mad, dashing itself against the sides of its glass prison, leaping to and fro, and from side to side, squealing with rage, or with terror, or with both. Perhaps it foresaw what was coming. There is no fathoming the intelligence of what we call the lower animals. It's a funny way. We some of us have funny ways, beside cats. Now attention, observe this little toy. You've seen something of its kind before. It's a spring gun. You pull the spring, drop the charge into the barrel, release the spring, and the charge is fired. I'll unlock this safe, which is built into the wall. It's a letter lock. The combination just now is whiskey. You see, that's a hint to you. You'll notice the safe is strongly made. It's airtight, fireproof. The outer casing is of triple-plated drill-proof steel. The contents are valuable, to me, and devilish dangerous. I'd pity the thief who, in his innocent ignorance, broke in to steal. Look inside. You see it's full of balls, glass balls, each in its own little separate nest. Light as feathers, transparent. You can see right through them. Here are a couple, like tiny pills. They contain neither dynamite, nor cordite, nor anything of the kind. Yet, given a fair field and no favour, they'll work more mischief than all the explosives man has fashioned. Take hold of one. You say your heart is broken. Squeeze this under your nose. It wants but a gentle pressure. And in less time than no time, you'll be in the land where they say there are no broken hearts. He shrunk back. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't want the thing. Take it away. Think twice. The chance may not recur. I tell you I don't want it. Sure? Consider. Of course I'm sure. Then the cat shall have it. Let the poor brute go. The poor brute's going. To the land which is so near, and yet so far. Once more, if you please. Attention. Notice what I do with this toy gun. I pull back the spring. I insert this small glass pellet. I thrust the muzzle of the gun through the opening in the glass box which contains the Apostle's cat. You'll observe it fits quite close, which, on the whole, is perhaps as well for us. I'm about to release the spring. Close attention, please. Notice the effect. Atherton, let the brute go. The brute's gone. I've released the spring. The pellet has been discharged. It has struck against the roof of the glass box. It has been broken by the contact, and hey presto, the cat lies dead, and that in face of its 9 lives. You perceive how still it is. How still. Let's hope that now it's really happy. The cat which I choose to believe is Paul Lessingham's has received its quietus. In the morning, I'll send it back to him with my respectful compliments. He'll miss it if I don't. Reflect. Think of a huge bomb filled with what we'll call Atherton's magic vapour, fired, say, from a 120-ton gun, bursting at a given elevation over the heads of an opposing force. Properly managed, in less than an instant of time, 100,000 men, quite possibly more, would drop down dead, as if smitten by the lightning of the skies. Isn't that something like a weapon, sir? I'm not well. I want to get away. I wish I'd never come. That was all Woodville had to say. Rubbish. You're adding to your stock of information every second, and in these days, when a member of Parliament is supposed to know all about everything, information's the one thing wanted. Empty your glass, man. That's the time of day for you. I handed him his tumbler. He drained what was left of its contents. Then, in a fit of tipsy, childish temper, he flung the tumbler from him. I had placed, carelessly enough, the second pellet within a foot of the edge of the table. The shock of the heavy beaker striking the board close to it set it rolling. I was at the other side. I started forward to stop its motion, but I was too late. Before I could reach the crystal globule, it had fallen off the edge of the table onto the floor at Woodville's feet and smashed in, falling. As it smashed, he was looking down, wondering, no doubt in his stupidity, what the pother was about. For I was shouting and making something of a clatter in my efforts to prevent the catastrophe which I saw was coming. On the instant, as the vapour secreted in the broken pellet gained access to the air, he fell forward onto his face. Rushing to him, I snatched his senseless body from the ground and dragged it staggeringly towards the door, which opened onto the yard. Flinging the door open, I got him into the open air. As I did so, I found myself confronted by someone who stood outside. It was Lessingham's mysterious Egypto-Arabian friend, my morning's visitor. Chapter 17. Magic or miracle? The passage into the yard from the electrically lit laboratory was a passage from brilliancy to gloom. The shrouded figure standing in the shadow was like some object in a dream. My own senses reeled. It was only because I had resolutely held my breath and kept my face averted that I had not succumbed to the fate which had overtaken Woodville. Had I been a moment longer in gaining the open air, it would have been too late. As it was, in placing Woodville on the ground, I stumbled over him. My senses left me. Even as they went, I was conscious of exclaiming, remembering the saying about the engineer being hoist by his own petard. Atherton's magic vapour. My sensations on returning to consciousness were curious. I found myself being supported in someone's arms. A stranger's face was bending over me, and the most extraordinary pair of eyes I had ever seen were looking into mine. "Who the deuce are you?" I asked. Then, understanding that it was my uninvited visitor, with scant ceremony, I drew myself away from him. By the light which was streaming through the laboratory door, I saw that Woodville was lying close beside me, stark and still. "Is he dead?" I cried. "Percy, speak, man. It's not so bad with you as that." But it was pretty bad. So bad that as I bent down and looked at him, my heart beat uncomfortably fast, lest it was as bad as it could be. His heart seemed still. The vapour took effect directly on the cardiac centres, to revive their action, and that instantly was indispensable. Yet my brain was in such a whirl that I could not even think of how to set about beginning. Had I been alone, it is more than probable Woodville would have died. As I stared at him, senselessly, aimlessly, the stranger, passing his arms beneath his body, extended himself at full length upon his motionless form. Putting his lips to Percy's, he seemed to be pumping life from his own body into the unconscious man's. As I gazed, bewildered, surprised, presently there came a movement of Percy's body. His limbs twitched, as if he was in pain. By degrees, the motions became convulsive, till on a sudden he bestirred himself to such effect that the stranger was rolled right off him. I bent down, to find that the young gentleman's condition still seemed very far from satisfactory. There was a rigidity about the muscles of his face, a clamminess about his skin, a disagreeable suggestiveness about the way in which his teeth and the whites of his eyes were exposed, which was uncomfortable to contemplate. The stranger must have seen what was passing through my mind. Not a very difficult thing to see. Pointing to the recumbent Percy, he said, with that queer foreign twang of his, which, whatever it had seemed like in the morning, sounded musical enough just then. All will be well with him. I'm not so sure. The stranger did not deign to answer. He was kneeling on one side of the victim of modern science, I on the other, passing his hand to and fro in front of the unconscious countenance. As if by magic, all semblance of discomfort vanished from Percy's features, and, to all appearances, he was placidly asleep. Have you hypnotized him? What does it matter? If it was a case of hypnotism, it was very neatly done. The conditions were both unusual and trying. The effect produced seemed all that could be desired. The change brought about in half a dozen seconds was quite remarkable. I began to be aware of a feeling of quasi-respect for Paul Lessingham's friend. His morals might be peculiar, and manners he might have none. But in this case, at any rate, the end seemed to have justified the means. He went on. He sleeps. When he awakes, he will remember nothing that has been. Leave him. The night is warm. All will be well. As he said, the night was warm, and it was dry. Percy would come to little harm by being allowed to enjoy, for a while, the pleasant breezes. So I acted on the stranger's advice, and left him lying in the yard, while I had a little interview with the impromptu physician. Chapter 18. The apotheosis of the Beetle. The laboratory door was closed. The stranger was standing a foot or two away from it. I was further within the room, and was subjecting him to as keen a scrutiny as circumstances permitted. Beyond doubt, he was conscious of my observation, yet he bore himself with an air of indifference, which was suggestive of perfect unconcern. The fellow was oriental to the fingertips, that much was certain, yet in spite of a pretty wide personal knowledge of oriental people, I could not make up my mind as to the exact part of the East from which he came. He was hardly an Arab, he was not a fellah, he was not, unless I erred, a Mohammedan at all. There was something about him which was distinctly not Mussulmanic. So far as looks were concerned, he was not a flattering example of his race, whatever his race might be. The portentous size of his beak-like nose would have been, in itself, sufficient to damn him in any court of beauty. His lips were thick and shapeless, and this, joined to another peculiarity in his appearance, seemed to suggest that, in his veins, there ran more than a streak of Negro blood. The peculiarity alluded to was his semblance of great age. As one eyed him, one was reminded of the legends told of people who have been supposed to have retained something of their pristine vigour after having lived for centuries. As, however, one continued to gaze, one began to wonder if he really was so old as he seemed, if, indeed, he was exceptionally old at all. Negroes, and especially negresses, are apt to age with extreme rapidity. Among coloured folk, one sometimes encounters women whose faces seem to have been lined by the passage of centuries, yet whose actual tale of years would entitle them to regard themselves, here in England, as in the prime of life. The senility of the fellow's countenance, besides, was contradicted by the juvenescence of his eyes. No really old man could have had eyes like that. They were curiously shaped, reminding me of the elongated, faceted eyes of some queer creature with whose appearance I was familiar, although I could not, at the instant, recall its name. They glowed not only with the force and fire, but also with the frenzy of youth. More uncanny-looking eyes I'd never encountered. Their possessor could not be, in any sense of the word, a clubbable person, owing, probably, to some peculiar formation of the optic nerve one felt as one met his gaze, that he was looking right through you. More obvious danger signals never yet were placed in a creature's head. The individual who, having once caught sight of him, still sought to cultivate their owner's acquaintance, had only himself to thank if the very worst results of frequenting evil company promptly ensued. It happens that I am myself endowed with an unusual tenacity of vision. I could, for instance, easily outstare any man I ever met. Yet, as I continued to stare at this man, I was conscious that it was only by an effort of will that I was able to resist a baleful something which seemed to be passing from his eyes to mine. It might have been imagination, but in that sense, I'm not an imaginative man. And if it was imagination of an unpleasantly vivid kind. I could understand how, in the case of a nervous or a sensitive temperament, the fellow might exercise, by means of the peculiar quality of his glance alone, an influence of a most disastrous sort, which given an appropriate subject in the manifestation of its power, might approach almost to the supernatural. If ever man was endowed with the traditional evil eye, in which Italians, among modern nations, are such profound believers, it was he. When we had stared at each other for, I dare say, quite 5 minutes, I began to think I had had about enough of it. So, by way of breaking the ice, I put to him a question. "May I ask how you found your way into my backyard?" He did not reply in words, but raising his hands, he lowered them, palms downward, with a gesture which was peculiarly oriental. "Indeed? Is that so? Your meaning may be lucidity itself to you, but for my benefit, perhaps you would not mind translating it into words. Once more I ask, how did you find your way into my backyard?" Again, nothing but the gesture. Possibly, you're not sufficiently acquainted with English manners and customs to be aware that you have placed yourself within reach of the pains and penalties of the law. Were I to call in the police, you would find yourself in an awkward situation, and unless you are presently more explanatory, called in they will be. By way of answer, he indulged in a distortion of the countenance which might have been meant for a smile, and which seemed to suggest that he regarded the police with a contempt which was too great for words. "Why do you laugh? Do you think that being threatened with the police is a joke? You are not likely to find it so. Have you suddenly been bereft of the use of your tongue?" He proved that he had not by using it. "I have still the use of my tongue. That at least is something. Perhaps, since the subject of how you got into my backyard seems to be a delicate one, you will tell me why you got there. You know why I have come. Pardon me if I appear to flatly contradict you, but that is precisely what I do not know." "You do know." "Do I? Then in that case, I presume that you are here for the reason which appears upon the surface. To commit a felony." "You call me thief? What else are you? I'm no thief. You know why I have come." He raised his head a little. A look came into his eyes, which I felt that I ought to understand, yet to the meaning of which I seemed, for the instant, to have mislaid the key. I shrugged my shoulders. "I have come because you wanted me. Because I wanted you. On my word, that's sublime. All night you have wanted me. Do I not know? When she talked to you of him, and the blood boiled in your veins. When he spoke, and all the people listened, and you hated him, because he had honour in her eyes. I was startled. Either he meant what it appeared incredible that he could mean, or there was confusion somewhere. Take my advice, my friend, and don't try to come the bunco steerer over me. I'm a bit in that line myself, you know." This time, the score was mine. He was puzzled. "I know not what you talk of." "In that case, we're equal. I know not what you talk of either." His manner, for him, was childlike and bland. "What is it you do not know? This morning did I not say, 'If you want me, then I come'? I fancy I have some faint recollection of your being so good as to say something of the kind. But where's the application? Do you not feel for him the same as I?" "Who's the him?" "Paul Lessingham." It was spoken quietly, but with a degree of, to put it gently, spitefulness which showed that at least the will to do the apostle harm would not be lacking. "And pray, what is the common feeling which we have for him?" "Hate." Plainly, with this gentleman, hate meant hate, in the solid Oriental sense. I should hardly have been surprised if the mere utterance of the words had seared his lips. I am by no means prepared to admit that I have this feeling which you attribute to me, but even granting that I have, what then? Those who hate are kin. That also I should be slow to admit, but to go a step farther, what has all this to do with your presence on my premises at this hour of the night? You love her. This time, I did not ask him to supply the name, being unwilling that it should be soiled by the traffic of his lips. She loves him. That is not well. If you choose, she shall love you. That will be well. Indeed. And pray, how is this consummation, which is so devoutly to be desired, to be brought about? Put your hand into mine. Say that you wish it. It shall be done. Moving a step forward, he stretched out his hand towards me. I hesitated. There was that in the fellow's manner which, for the moment, had for me an unwholesome fascination. Memories flashed through my mind of stupid stories, which have been told of compacts made with the devil. I almost felt as if I was standing in the actual presence of one of the powers of evil. I thought of my love for Marjorie, which had revealed itself after all these years, of the delight of holding her in my arms, of feeling the pressure of her lips to mine as my gaze met his. The lower side of what the conquest of this fair lady would mean burned in my brain. Fierce imaginings blazed before my eyes. To win her, only to win her. What nonsense he was talking. What empty brag it was. Suppose, just for the sake of the joke, I did put my hand in his, and did wish, right out, what it was plain he knew. If I wished, what harm would it do? It would be the purest jest. Out of his own mouth he would be confounded, for it was certain that nothing would come of it. Why should I not do it then? I would act on his suggestion. I would carry the thing right through. Already I was advancing towards him, when I stopped. I don't know why. On the instant, my thoughts went off at a tangent. What sort of a blackguard did I call myself that I should take a woman's name in vain for the sake of playing fool's tricks with such scum of the earth as the hideous vagabond in front of me, and that the name of the woman whom I loved? Rage took hold of me. "You hound!" I cried, in my sudden passage from one mood to another. I was filled with the desire to shake the life half out of him, but so soon as I moved a step in his direction, intending war instead of peace, he altered the position of his hand, holding it out towards me as if forbidding my approach. Directly he did so, quite involuntarily, I pulled up dead, as if my progress had been stayed by bars of iron and walls of steel. For the moment, I was astonished to the verge of stupefaction. The sensation was peculiar. I was as incapable of advancing another inch in his direction as if I had lost the use of my limbs. I was even incapable of attempting to advance. At first, I could only stare and gape. Presently, I began to have an inkling of what had happened. The scoundrel had almost succeeded in hypnotizing me. That was a nice thing to happen to a man of my sort at my time of life. A shiver went down my back. What might have occurred if I had not pulled up in time? What pranks might a creature of that character not have been disposed to play? It was the old story of the peril of playing with edged tools. I had made the dangerous mistake of underrating the enemy's strength. Evidently, in his own line, the fellow was altogether something out of the usual way. I believe that even as it was, he thought he had me. As I turned away and leaned against the table at my back, I fancied that he shivered, as if this proof of my being still my own master was unexpected. I was silent. It took some seconds to enable me to recover from the shock of the discovery of the peril in which I had been standing. Then I resolved that I would endeavour to do something which should make me equal to this gentleman of many talents. "Take my advice, my friend, and don't attempt to play that hanky-panky off onto me again. I don't know what you talk of. Don't lie to me, or I'll burn you into ashes." Behind me was an electrical machine, giving an 18-inch spark. It was set in motion by a lever fitted into the table, which I could easily reach from where I sat. As I spoke, the visitor was treated to a little exhibition of electricity. The change in his bearing was amusing. He shook with terror. He salaamed down to the ground. My lord, have mercy, oh my lord." "Then you be careful, that's all. You may suppose yourself to be something of a magician, but it happens, unfortunately for you, that I can do a bit in that line myself. Perhaps I'm a trifle better at the game than you are, especially as you have ventured into my stronghold, which contains magic enough to make a show of 100,000 such as you." Taking down a bottle from a shelf, I sprinkled a drop or two of its contents on the floor. Immediately flames arose, accompanied by a blinding vapour. It was a sufficiently simple illustration of one of the qualities of phosphorus bromide, but its effect upon my visitor was as startling as it was unexpected. If I could believe the evidence of my own eyesight, in the very act of giving utterance to a scream of terror he disappeared. How, or why, or whither, there was nothing to show. In his place, where he had been standing, there seemed to be a dim object of some sort in a state of frenzied agitation on the floor. The phosphorescent vapour was confusing. The lights appeared to be suddenly burning low. Before I had sense enough to go and see if there was anything there, and if so, what, the flames had vanished. The man himself had reappeared, and prostrated on his knees, was salaaming in a condition of abject terror. My lord, he whined. "I entreat you, my lord, to use me as your slave. I'll use you as my slave." Whether he or I was the more agitated it would have been difficult to say. but at least it would not have done to betray my feelings as he did his. Stand up. He stood up. I eyed him as he did with an interest which, so far as I was concerned, was of a distinctly new and original sort. Whether or not I had been the victim of an ocular delusion, I could not be sure. It was incredible to suppose that he could have disappeared, as he had seemed to disappear. It was also incredible that I could have imagined his disappearance. If the thing had been a trick, I had not the faintest notion how it had been worked. And if it was not a trick, then what was it? Was it something new in scientific marvels? Could he give me as much instruction in the qualities of unknown forces as I could him? In the meanwhile, he stood in an attitude of complete submission, with downcast eyes and hands crossed upon his breast. I started to cross-examine him. I'm going to ask you some questions. So long as you answer them promptly, truthfully, you will be safe. Otherwise, you had best beware. Ask, O my lord. What is the nature of your objection to Mr. Lessingham? Revenge. What has he done to you that you should wish to be revenged on him? It is the feud of the innocent blood. What do you mean by that? On his hands is the blood of my kin. It cries aloud for vengeance. Who has he killed? That, my lord, is for me, and for him. I see. Am I to understand that you do not choose to answer me, and that I am again to use my magic? I saw that he quivered. My lord, he has spilled the blood of her who has lain upon his breast. I hesitated. What he meant appeared clear enough. Perhaps it would be as well not to press for further details. The words pointed to what it might be courteous to call an Eastern romance, though it was hard to conceive of the apostle figuring as the hero of such a theme. It was the old tale retold, that to the life of every man there is a background, that it is precisely in the unlikeliest cases that the background's darkest. What would that penny plain and twopence-coloured bogey, the nonconformist conscience, make of such a story if it were blazoned through the land? Would Paul not come down with a run? Spilling blood is a figure of speech, pretty, perhaps, but vague. If you mean that Mr. Lessingham has been killing someone, your surest and most effectual revenge would be gained by an appeal to the law. What has the Englishman's law to do with me? If you can prove that he has been guilty of murder, it would have a great deal to do with you. I assure you that at any rate, in that sense, the Englishman's law is no respecter of persons. Show him to be guilty, and it would hang Paul Lessingham as indifferently and as cheerfully as it would hang Bill Brown. Is that so? It is so, as, if you choose, you will be easily able to prove to your own entire satisfaction. He had raised his head and was looking at something which he seemed to see in front of him, with a maleficent glare in his sensitive eyes, which it was not nice to see. He would be shamed? Indeed he would be shamed. Before all men? Before all men. And I take it, before all women too. And he would hang, if shown to have been guilty of wilful murder? Yes. His hideous face was lighted up by a sort of diabolical exultation which made it, if that were possible, more hideous still. I had apparently given him a wrinkle which pleased him most consummately. Perhaps I will do that in the end. In the end, he opened his eyes to their widest limits, then shut them tight, as if to gloat on the picture which his fancy painted, then reopened them. In the meantime, I will have vengeance in my own fashion. He knows already that the avenger is upon him. He has good reason to know it, and through the days and the nights, the knowledge shall be with him still, and it shall be to him as the bitterness of death, aye, of many deaths. For he will know that escape there is none, and that for him there shall be no more sun in the sky, and that the terror shall be with him by night and by day, at his rising up and at his lying down. Wherever his eyes shall turn, it shall be there. Yet, behold, the sap and the juice of my vengeance is in this, in that though he shall be very sure that the days that are as the days of his death, yet shall he know that the death, the great death, is coming, and shall be on him when I will. The fellow spoke like an inspired maniac. If he meant half what he said, and if he did not, then his looks and his tones belied him. Then a promising future bade fair to be in store for Mr. Lessingham, and also, circumstances being as they were, for Marjorie. It was this latter reflection which gave me pause. Either this imprecatory fanatic would have to be disposed of by Lessingham himself, or by someone acting on his behalf. and so far as their power of doing mischief went, his big words proved empty windbags, or Marjorie would have to be warned that there was at least one passage in her suitor's life, into which, ere it was too late, it was advisable that inquiry should be made, to allow Marjorie to irrevocably link her fate with the apostles, without being first of all made aware that he was, to all intents and purposes, a haunted man. That was not to be thought of. You employ large phrases. My words cooled the other's heated blood. Once more his eyes were cast down, his hands crossed upon his breast. I crave my lord's pardon. My wound is ever new. By the way, what was the secret history this morning of that little incident of the cockroach? He glanced up quickly. Cockroach, I know not what you say. Well, was it Beetle then? Beetle! He seemed all at once to have lost his voice. The word was gasped. After you went, we found upon a sheet of paper a capitally executed drawing of a beetle, which, I fancy, you must have left behind you. Scarabaeus sacer, wasn't it? I know not what you talk of. Its discovery seemed to have quite a singular effect on Mr. Lessingham. Now why was that? I know nothing. Oh yes, you do. And before you go, I mean to know something too. The man was trembling, looking this way and that, showing signs of marked discomfiture, that there was something about that ancient scarab, which figures so largely in the still unravelled tangles of the Egyptian mythologies, and the effect which the mere sight of its cartouche, for the drawing had resembled something of the kind, had had on such a seasoned vessel as Paul Lessingham, which might be well worth my finding out, I felt convinced. The man's demeanour, on my recurring to the matter, told its own plain tale. I made up my mind, if possible, to probe the business to the bottom, then and there. Listen to me, my friend. I am a plain man, and I use plain speech. It's a kind of hobby I have. You will give me the information I require, and that at once, or I will pit my magic against yours. In which case, I think it extremely probable that you will come off worst from the encounter. I reached out for the lever, and the exhibition of electricity recommenced. Immediately his tremors were redoubled. My lord, I know not of what you talk. None of your lies for me. Tell me why, at the sight of the thing on that sheet of paper, Paul Lessingham went green and yellow. Ask him, my lord. Probably, later on, that is what I shall do. In the meantime, I am asking you, answer, or look out for squalls. The electrical exhibition was going on. He was glaring at it as if he wished that it would stop. As if ashamed of his cowardice, plainly, on a sudden, he made a desperate effort to get the better of his fears, and succeeded better than I had expected or desired. He drew himself up with what, in him, amounted to an air of dignity. I'm a child of Isis. It struck me that he made this remark, not so much to impress me, as with a view of elevating his own low spirits. Are you? Then in that case, I regret that I am unable to congratulate the lady on her offspring. When I said that, a ring came into his voice which I had not heard before. Silence! You know not of what you speak. I warn you, as I warned Paul Lessingham, be careful not to go too far. Be not like him. Heed my warning. What is it I am being warned against? The beetle. Yes, the beetle. Were I upon oath, and this statement being made in the presence of witnesses, say, in a solicitor's office, I standing in fear of pains and penalties, I think that at this point I should leave the paper blank. No man likes to own himself a fool, or that he ever was a fool. And ever since I have been wondering whether, on that occasion, that child of Isis did, or did not, play the fool with me. His performance was realistic enough at the time, heaven knows, but as it gets farther and farther away, I ask myself, more and more confidently, as time effluxes, whether, after all, it was not clever juggling, superhumanly clever juggling, if you will, that and nothing more. If it was something more, then with a vengeance. There is more in heaven and earth than is dreamed of in our philosophy. The mere possibility opens vistas which the sane mind fears to contemplate. Since then, I am not on oath, and should I fall short of verbal accuracy, I do not need to fear the engines of the law. What seemed to happen was this. He was standing within about 10 feet of where I leaned against the edge of the table. The light was full on, so that it was difficult to suppose that I could make a mistake as to what took place in front of me. As he replied to my mocking allusion to the beetle by echoing my own words, he vanished. Or rather, I saw him taking a different shape before my eyes. His loose draperies all fell off him, and, as they were in the very act of falling, there issued, or there seemed to issue out of them, a monstrous creature of the beetle tribe. The man himself was gone. On the point of size, I wish to make myself clear. My impression, when I saw it first, was that it was as large as the man had been, and that it was, in some way, standing up on end, the legs towards me. But the moment it came in view, it began to dwindle, and that so rapidly that in a couple of seconds at most, a little heap of drapery was lying on the floor, on which was a truly astonishing example of the coleoptera. It appeared to be a beetle. It was, perhaps, 6 or 7 inches high and about a foot in length. Its scales were of a vivid golden green. I could distinctly see where the wings were sheathed along the back, and as they seemed to be slightly agitated, I looked every moment to see them opened and the thing take wing. I was so astonished, as who would not have been, that for an appreciable space of time I was practically in a state of stupefaction. I could do nothing but stare. I was acquainted with the legendary transmigrations of Isis, and with the story of the beetle which issues from the woman's womb through all eternity, and with the other pretty tales. But this, of which I was an actual spectator, was something new, even in legends. If the man with whom I had just been speaking was gone, where had he gone to? If this glittering creature was there, in his stead, whence had it come? I do protest this much, that after the first shock of surprise had passed, I retained my presence of mind. I felt as an investigator might feel, who has stumbled haphazard on some astounding, some epoch-making discovery. I was conscious that I should have to make the best use of my mental faculties if I was to take full advantage of so astonishing an accident. I kept my glance riveted on the creature, with the idea of photographing it on my brain. I believed that if it were possible to take a retinal print, which it someday will be, you would have a perfect picture of what it was I saw. Beyond doubt, it was a lamelicorn, one of the Copridae. With the one exception of its monstrous size, there were the characteristics in plain view: the convex body, the large head, the projecting clypeus. More, its smooth head and throat seemed to suggest that it was a female. Equally beyond a doubt, apart from its size, there were unusual features present too. The eyes were not only unwontedly conspicuous, they gleamed as if they were lighted by internal flames. In some indescribable fashion, they reminded me of my vanished visitor. The colouring was superb, and the creature appeared to have the chameleon-like faculty of lightening and darkening the shades at will. Its not least curious feature was its restlessness. It was in a state of continual agitation, and as if it resented my inspection, the more I looked at it, the more its agitation grew. As I have said, I expected every moment to see it take wing and circle through the air. All the while, I was casting about in my mind as to what means I could use to effect its capture. I did think of killing it, and on the whole, I rather wished that I had at any rate attempted slaughter. There were dozens of things lying ready to my hand, any one of which would have severely tried its constitution. But on the spur of the moment, the only method of taking it alive which occurred to me was to pop over it a big tin canister which had contained soda lime. This canister was on the floor to my left. I moved towards it as nonchalantly as I could, keeping an eye on that shining wonder all the time. Directly I moved, its agitation perceptibly increased. It was, so to speak, all one whir of tremblement. It scintillated, as if its coloured scales had been so many prisms. It began to unsheath its wings, as if it had finally decided that it would make use of them. Picking up the tin, disembarrassing it of its lid, I sprang towards my intended victim. Its wings opened wide. Obviously it was about to rise, but it was too late. Before it had cleared the ground, the tin was over it. It remained over it, however, for an instant only. I had stumbled in my haste, and in my effort to save myself from falling face foremost onto the floor, I was compelled to remove my hands from the tin. Before I was able to replace them, the tin was sent flying, and while I was still partially recumbent, within 18 inches of me, that beetle swelled and swelled, until it had assumed its former portentous dimensions, when, as it seemed, it was enveloped by a human shape, and in less time than no time, there stood in front of me, naked from top to toe, my truly versatile Oriental friend. One startling fact nudity revealed: that I had been egregiously mistaken on the question of sex. My visitor was not a man, but a woman, and judging from the brief glimpse which I had of her body, by no means old or ill-shaped either. If that transformation was not a bewildering one, then 2 and 2 make 5. The most level-headed scientist would temporarily have lost his mental equipoise on witnessing such a quick change as that. Within a span or two of his own nose, I was not only witless, I was breathless too. I could only gape, and while I gaped, the woman, stooping down, picking up her draperies, began to huddle them on her anyhow, and also to skedaddle towards the door which led into the yard. When I observed this last manoeuvre, to some extent I did rise to the requirements of the situation. Leaping up, I rushed to stay her flight. "Stop!" I shouted, but she was too quick for me. Ere I could reach her, she had opened the door and was through it. And what was more, she had slammed it in my face. In my excitement, I did some fumbling with the handle. When, in my turn, I was in the yard, she was out of sight. I did fancy I saw a dim form disappearing over the wall at the further side, and I made for it as fast as I knew how. I clambered onto the wall, looking this way and that, but there was nothing and no one to be seen. I listened for the sound of retreating footsteps, but all was still. Apparently, I had the entire neighbourhood to my own sweet self. My visitor had vanished. Time devoted to pursuit, I felt, would be time ill spent. As I returned across the yard, Woodville, who still was taking his rest under the open canopy of heaven, sat up. Seemingly my approach had roused him out of slumber. At sight of me he rubbed his eyes, and yawned and blinked. "I say," he remarked, not at all unreasonably, "where am I? You're on holy, or on haunted ground. Hang me if I quite know which. But that's where you are, my boy. By Jove, I am feeling queer. I have got a headache, don't you know? I shouldn't be in the least surprised at anything you have, or haven't. I'm beyond surprise. It's a drop of whiskey you are wanting, and what I'm wanting too. Only for goodness sake, drop me none of your drops. Mine is a case for a bottle at the least." I put my arm through his, and went with him into the laboratory, and when we were in, I shut and locked and barred the door. Chapter 19. The Lady Rages. Dora Grayling stood in the doorway. "I told your servant he need not trouble to show me in, and I've come without my aunt. I hope I'm not intruding." She was, confoundedly, and it was on the tip of my tongue to tell her so. She came into the room with twinkling eyes, looking radiantly happy, that sort of look which makes even a plain young woman prepossessing. "Am I intruding? I believe I am." She held out her hand while she was still a dozen feet away, and when I did not at once dash forward to make a clutch at it, she shook her head and made a little mouth at me. "What's the matter with you? Aren't you well?" I was not well. I was very far from well. I was as unwell as I could be without being positively ill, and any person of common discernment would have perceived it at a glance. At the same time, I was not going to admit anything of the kind to her. "Thank you, I'm perfectly well." Then if I were you, I would endeavour to become imperfectly well. A little imperfection in that direction might make you appear to more advantage. I'm afraid that I am not one of those persons who ever do appear to much advantage. Did I not tell you so last night? I believe you did say something of the kind. It's very good of you to remember. Have you forgotten something else which you said to me last night? You can hardly expect me to keep fresh in my memory all the follies of which my tongue is guilty. Thank you, that's quite enough. Good day. She turned as if to go. Miss Grayling. Mr. Atherton, what's the matter? What have I been saying now? Last night you invited me to come and see you this morning. Is that one of the follies of which your tongue was guilty? The engagement had escaped my recollection. It is a fact, and my face betrayed me. You had forgotten? Her cheeks flamed, her eyes sparkled. You must pardon my stupidity for not having understood that the invitation was of that general kind, which is never meant to be acted on. She was halfway to the door before I stopped her. I had to take her by the shoulder to do it. Miss Grayling, you are hard on me. I suppose I am. Is anything harder than to be intruded on by an undesired and unexpected guest? Now you are harder still. If you knew what I have gone through since our conversation of last night, in your strength you would be merciful. Indeed, What have you gone through? I hesitated. What I actually had gone through, I certainly did not propose to tell her. Other reasons apart, I did not desire to seem madder than I admittedly am, and I lacked sufficient plausibility to enable me to concoct, on the spur of the moment, a plain tale of the doings of my midnight visitor, which would have suggested that the narrator was perfectly sane. So I fenced, or tried to. For one thing, I have had no sleep. I had not one single wink. When I did get between the sheets, all night I lay in agony. I suffered from that worst form of nightmare, the nightmare of the man who is wide awake. There was continually before my fevered eyes the strange figure of that nameless thing. I had often smiled at tales of haunted folk. Here was I one of them. My feelings were not rendered more agreeable by a strengthening conviction that if I had only retained the normal attitude of a scientific observer, I should, in all probability, have solved the mystery of my Oriental friend, and that his example of the genus of Copridae might have been pinned, by a very large pin, on a monstrous piece, of cork. It was galling to reflect that he and I had played together a game of bluff, a game at which civilization was once more proved to be a failure. She could not have seen all this in my face, but she saw something, because her own look softened. "You do look tired." She seemed to be casting about in her own mind for a cause. "You have been worrying." She glanced round the big laboratory. "Have you been spending the night in this wizard's cave?" "Pretty well." "Oh." The monosyllable, as she uttered it, was big with meaning. Uninvited, she seated herself in an armchair, a huge old thing of shagreen leather, which would have held half a dozen of her. Demure in it she looked, like an agreeable reminiscence, alive and a little up-to-date of the women of long ago. Her dove-grey eyes seemed to perceive so much more than they cared to show. "How is it that you have forgotten that you asked me to come? Didn't you mean it?" "Of course I meant it." "Then how is it you've forgotten?" "I didn't forget." "Don't tell fibs. Something is the matter. Tell me what it is. Is it that I am too early?" "Nothing of the sort. You couldn't be too early." "Thank you. When you pay a compliment, even so neat an one as that, sometimes you should look as if you meant it. It is early. I know it's early, but afterwards I want you to come to lunch. I told Aunt that I would bring you back with me. You are much better to me than I deserve." "Perhaps." A tone came into her voice which was almost pathetic. "I think that to some men, women are almost better than they deserve. I don't know why. I suppose it pleases them. It is odd." There was a different intonation, a dryness. "Have you forgotten what I came for?" "Not a bit of it. I am not quite the brute I seem. You came to see an illustration of that pleasant little fancy of mine for slaughtering my fellows. The fact is, I'm hardly in a mood for that just now. I've been illustrating it too much already." "What do you mean?" "Well, for one thing, it's been murdering Lessingham's cat. Mr. Lessingham's cat. Then it almost murdered Percy Woodville." "Mr. Atherton, I wish you wouldn't talk like that. It's a fact. It was a question of a little matter in a wrong place, and if it hadn't been for something very like a miracle, he'd be dead. I wish you wouldn't have anything to do with such things. I hate them." I stared. "Hate them? I thought you'd come to see an illustration. And pray, what was your notion of an illustration?" "Well, another cat would have had to be killed at least. And do you suppose that I would have sat still while a cat was being killed for my edification? It needn't necessarily have been a cat, but something would have had to be killed. How are you going to illustrate the death-dealing propensities of a weapon of that sort without it? Is it possible that you imagine that I came here to see something killed? Then for what did you come?" I do not know what there was about the question which was startling, but as soon as it was out, she went a fiery red. "Because I was a fool." I was bewildered. Either she had got out of the wrong side of bed, or I had, or we both had. Here she was, assailing me, hammer and tongs so far as I could see, for absolutely nothing. "You are pleased to be satirical at my expense. I should not dare. Your detection of me would be so painfully rapid." I was in no mood for jangling. I turned a little away from her. Immediately she was at my elbow. "Mr. Atherton, Miss Grayling, are you cross with me? Why should I be? If it pleases you to laugh at my stupidity, you are completely justified. But you are not stupid. No, nor you satirical. You are not stupid. You know you are not stupid. It was only stupidity on my part to pretend that you were. It is very good of you to say so, but I fear that I am an indifferent host. Although you would not care for an illustration, there may be other things which you might find amusing. Why do you keep on snubbing me? I keep on snubbing you. You're always snubbing me. You know you are. Sometimes I feel as if I hated you. Miss Grayling, I do. After all, it is only natural. That is how you talk. As if I were a child, and you were. Oh, I don't know what. Well, Mr. Atherton, I'm sorry to be obliged to leave you. I have enjoyed my visit very much. I only hope I have not seemed too intrusive. She flounced. Flounce was the only appropriate word. Out of the room before I could stop her. I caught her in the passage. Miss Grayling, I entreat you. Pray do not entreat me, Mr. Atherton. Standing still, she turned to me. I would rather show myself to the door as I showed myself in. But if that is impossible, might I ask you not to speak to me between this and the street? The hint was broad enough, even for me. I escorted her through the hall without a word. In perfect silence, she shook the dust of my abode from off her feet. I'd made a pretty mess of things. I felt it as I stood on the top of the steps and watched her going. She was walking off at 4 miles an hour. I'd not even ventured to ask to be allowed to call a hansom. It was beginning to occur to me that this was a case in which another blow upon the river might be, to say the least of it, advisable, and I was just returning into the house with the intention of putting myself into my flannels when a cab drew up and old Linden got out of it. Chapter 20. A heavy father. Mr. Linden was excited. There is no mistaking it when he is, because with him excitement means perspiration, and as soon as he was out of the cab, he took off his hat and began to wipe the lining. Atherton, I want to speak to you, most particularly, somewhere in private. I took him into my laboratory. It is my rule to take no one there. It is a workshop, not a playroom. The place is private, but recently my rules had become dead letters. Directly he was inside, Linden began puffing and stewing, wiping his forehead, throwing out his chest as if he were oppressed by a sense of his own importance. Then he started off talking at the top of his voice, and it is not a low one either. Atherton, I've always looked on you as a kind of a son. That's very kind of you. I've always regarded you as a level-headed fellow, a man from whom sound advice can be obtained when sound advice is most to be desired. That also is very kind of you, and therefore I make no apology for coming to you at what may be regarded as a strictly domestic crisis, at a moment in the history of the Lindens when delicacy and common sense are essentially required. This time I contented myself with nodding. Already I perceived what was coming. Somehow, when I am with a man, I feel so much more clear-headed than I do when I am with a woman, realise so much better the nature of the ground on which I am standing. What do you know of this man Lessingham? I knew it was coming. What all the world knows. And what does all the world know of him? I ask you that. A flashy, plausible, shallow-pated carpetbagger. That is what all the world knows of him. The man's a political adventurer. He snatches a precarious and criminal notoriety by trading on the follies of his fellow countrymen. He is devoid of decency, destitute of principle, and impervious to all the feelings of a gentleman. What do you know of him besides this? I'm not prepared to admit that I do know that. Oh yes, you do. Don't talk nonsense. You choose to screen the fellow. I say what I mean. I always have said, and I always shall say. What do you know of him outside politics, of his family, of his private life? Well, not very much. Of course you don't, nor does anybody else. The man's a mushroom, or a toadstool rather, sprung up in the course of a single night, apparently out of some dirty ditch. Why, sir, not only is he without ordinary intelligence, he is even without a Brummagem substitute for manners. He had worked himself into a state of heat in which his countenance presented a not too agreeable assortment of scarlets and purples. He flung himself into a chair, threw his coat wide open, and his arms too, and started off again. The family of the Lindens is, at this moment, represented by a young woman, by my daughter, sir. She represents me, and it's her duty to represent me adequately. Adequately, sir. And what's more, between ourselves, sir, it's her duty to marry. My property's my own, and I wouldn't have it passed to either of my confounded brothers on any account. They're next door to fools, and they don't represent me in any possible sense of the word. My daughter, sir, can marry whom she pleases. Whom she pleases. There's no one in England, peer or commoner, who would not esteem it an honour to have her for his wife. I've told her so. Yes, sir, I've told her. Though you'd think that she, of all people in the world, wouldn't require telling. Yet what do you think she does? She actually carries on what I can't help calling a compromising acquaintance with this man Lessingham. No, but I say yes, and I wish to heaven I didn't. I've warned her against the scoundrel more than once. I've told her to cut him dead, and yet, as you saw yourself last night in the face of the assembled House of Commons, after that twaddling claptrap speech of his, in which there was not one sound sentiment, nor an idea which would hold water, she positively went away with him, in the most ostentatious and disgraceful fashion, on his arm, and actually snubbed her father. It is monstrous that a parent, a father, should be subjected to such treatment by his child. The poor old boy polished his brow with his pocket handkerchief. When I got home, I told her what I thought of her. I promise you that. And I told her what I thought of him. I didn't mince my words with her. There are occasions when plain speaking is demanded, and that was one. I positively forbade her to speak to the fellow again, or to recognise him if she met him in the street. I pointed out to her, with perfect candour, that the fellow was an infernal scoundrel, that and nothing else, and that he would bring disgrace on whoever came into contact with him, even with the end of a barge pole. And what do you think she said? She promised to obey you, I make no doubt. Did she, sir? By gad, did she? That shows how much you know her. She said, and by gad, by her manner and the way she went on, you'd have thought that she was the parent and I was the child. She said that I grieved her, that she was disappointed in me, that times have changed. Yes, sir, she said that times have changed. That nowadays, parents weren't Russian autocrats. No, sir, not Russian autocrats. That she was sorry she couldn't oblige me. Yes, sir, that was how she put it. She was sorry she couldn't oblige me, but it was altogether out of the question to suppose that she could put a period to a friendship which she valued, simply on account of my unreasonable prejudices. And in short, she told me to go the devil, sir. And did you? I was on the point of asking him if he went, but I checked myself in time. Let us look at the matter as men of the world. What do you know against Lessingham, apart from his politics? That's just it. I know nothing. In a sense, isn't that in his favour? I don't see how you make that out. I don't mind telling you that I've had inquiries made. He's not been in the House 6 years. This is his second Parliament. He's jumped up like a jack-in-the-box. His first constituency was Harwich. They've got him still, and much good may he do him. But how he came to stand for the place, or who, or what, or where he was before he stood for the place, no one seems to have the faintest notion. Hasn't he been a great traveller? I never heard of it. Not in the East? Has he told you so? No, I was only wondering. Well, it seems to me that to find out that nothing is known against him is something in his favour. My dear Sidney, don't talk nonsense. What it proves is simply that he's a nothing and a nobody. Had he been anything or anyone, something would have been known about him, either for or against. I don't want my daughter to marry a man who's shot up through a trap, simply because nothing is known against him. Hang me, if I wouldn't 10 times sooner she should marry you. When he said that, my heart leaped in my bosom. I had to turn away. I'm afraid that is out of the question. He stopped in his tramping and looked at me askance. Why? I felt that, if I was not careful, I should be done for, and probably, in his present mood, Marjorie too. My dear Lyndon, I cannot tell you how grateful I am to you for your suggestion, but I can only repeat that, unfortunately, Anything of the kind is out of the question. I don't see why. Perhaps not. You're a pretty lot, upon my word. I'm afraid we are. I want you to tell her that Lessingham is a damned scoundrel. I see, but I would suggest that if I am to use the influence with which you credit me to the best advantage, or to preserve a shred of it, I had hardly better state the fact quite so bluntly as that. I don't care how you state it as you like. Only I want you to soak her mind with a loathing of the fellow. I want you to paint him in his true colours. In fact, I want you to choke him off. While he still struggled with his words, and with the perspiration on his brow, Edwards entered. I turned to him. What is it? Miss Linden, sir, wishes to see you particularly, and at once. At that moment, I found the announcement a trifle perplexing. It delighted Linden. He began to stutter and to stammer. To the very thing. Couldn't have been better. Show her in here. Hide me somewhere. I don't care where. Behind that screen. You use your influence with her. Give her a good talking to tell her what I've told you. And at the critical moment I'll come in. And then if we can't manage her between us, it'll be a wonder. The proposition staggered me. But my dear Mr. Linden, I fear that I cannot... He cut me short. Here she comes. Ere I could stop him, he was behind the screen. I had not seen him move with such agility before. And before I could expostulate, Marjorie was in the room. Something which was in her bearing, in her face, in her eyes, quickened the beating of my pulses. She looked as if something had come into her life and taken the joy clean out of it. Chapter 21. The Terror in the Night. Sydney, she cried. I'm so glad that I can see you. She might be, but at that moment I could scarcely assert that I was a sharer of her joy. I told you that if trouble overtook me, I should come to you, and I'm in trouble now. Such strange trouble. So was I, and in perplexity as well. An idea occurred to me. I would outwit her eavesdropping father. Come with me into the house. Tell me all about it there. She refused to budge. No, I will tell you all about it here. She looked about her, as it struck me queerly. This is just the sort of place in which to unfold a tale like mine. It looks uncanny. But me no buts. Sydney, don't torture me. Let me stop here where I am. Don't you see I'm haunted? She had seated herself. Now she stood up, holding her hands out in front of her in a state of extraordinary agitation, her manner as wild as her words. Why are you staring at me like that? Do you think I'm mad? I wonder if I'm going mad. Sydney, do people suddenly go mad? You're a bit of everything. You're a bit of a doctor too. Feel my pulse. There it is. Tell me if I'm ill. I felt her pulse. It did not need its swift beating to inform me that fever of some sort was in her veins. I gave her something in a glass. She held it up to the level of her eyes. What's this? It's a decoction of my own. You might not think it, but my brain sometimes gets into a whirl. I use it as a sedative. It will do you good. She drained the glass. It's done me good already. I believe it has. That's being something like a doctor. Well, Sydney, the storm has almost burst. Last night, Papa forbade me to speak to Paul Lessingham, by way of a prelude. Exactly. Mr. Linden. Yes, Mr. Linden. That's Papa. I fancy we almost quarrelled. I know Papa said some surprising things, but it's a way he has. He's apt to say surprising things. He's the best father in the world, but it's not in his nature to like a really clever person. Your good, high-dried old Tory never can. I've always thought that that's why he's so fond of you. Thank you. I presume that is the reason, though it had not occurred to me before. Since her entry, I had, to the best of my ability, been turning the position over in my mind. I came to the conclusion that all things considered, her father had probably as much right to be a sharer of his daughter's confidence as I had, even from the vantage of the screen, and that for him to hear a few home truths proceeding from her lips might serve to clear the air. From such a clearance, the lady would not be likely to come off worst. I had not the faintest inkling of what was the actual purport of her visit. She started off, as it seemed to me, at a tangent. Did I tell you last night about what took place yesterday morning? About the adventure of my finding the man? not a word. I believe I meant to. I'm half disposed to think he's brought me trouble. Isn't there some superstition about evil befalling whoever shelters a homeless stranger? We'll hope not, for humanity's sake. I fancy there is. I feel sure there is. Anyhow, listen to my story. Yesterday morning, before breakfast, to be accurate, between 8 and 9, I looked out of the window and I saw a crowd in the street. I sent Peter out to see what was the matter. He came back and said there was a man in a fit. I went out to look at the man in the fit. I found, lying on the ground, in the centre of the crowd, a man who, but for the tattered remnants of what had apparently once been a cloak, would have been stark naked. He was covered with dust and dirt and blood. A dreadful sight. As you know, I have had my smattering of instruction in first aid to the injured, and that kind of thing. So, as no one else seemed to have any sense, and the man seemed as good as dead, I thought I would try my hand. Directly I knelt down beside him. What do you think he said? Thank you. Nonsense. He said in such a queer, hollow, croaking voice, Paul Lessingham. I was dreadfully startled. To hear a perfect stranger, a man in his condition, utter that name in such a fashion, to me, of all people in the world, took me aback. The policeman who was holding his head remarked, "That's the first time he's opened his mouth. I thought he was dead." He opened his mouth a second time. A convulsive movement went all over him, and he exclaimed with the strangest earnestness and so loudly that you might have heard him at the other end of the street. "Be warned, Paul Lessingham, be warned." It was very silly of me, perhaps, but I cannot tell you how his words and his manner, the two together, affected me. Well, the long and the short of it was that I had him taken into the house and washed and put to bed, and I had the doctor sent for. The doctor could make nothing of it at all. He reported that the man seemed to be suffering from some sort of cataleptic seizure. I could see that he thought it likely to turn out almost as interesting a case as I did. Did you acquaint your father with the addition to his household? She looked at me quizzically. You see, when one has such a father as mine, one cannot tell him everything at once. There are occasions on which one requires time. I felt that this would be wholesome hearing for old Lyndon. Last night, after Papa and I had exchanged our little courtesies, which, it is to be hoped, were to Papa's satisfaction, since they were not to be mine, I went to see the patient. I was told that he had neither eaten nor drunk, moved nor spoken. But so soon as I approached his bed, he showed signs of agitation. He half raised himself upon his pillow, and he called out, as if he had been addressing some large assembly. I can't describe to you the dreadful something which was in his voice and on his face. "Paul Lessingham, beware, the Beetle." When she said that, I was startled. Are you sure those were the words he used? Quite sure. Do you think I could mistake them? Especially after what has happened since. I hear them singing in my ears. They haunt me all the time. She put her hands up to her face, as if to veil something from her eyes. I was becoming more and more convinced that there was something about the Apostle's connection with his Oriental friend which needed probing to the bottom. What sort of a man is he to look at, this patient of yours? I had my doubts as to the gentleman's identity, which her words dissolved, only, however, to increase my mystification in another direction. He seems to be between 30 and 40. He has light hair and straggling sandy whiskers. He is so thin as to be nothing but skin and bone. The doctor says it's a case of starvation. You say he has light hair and sandy whiskers. Are you sure the whiskers are real? She opened her eyes. Of course they're real. Why shouldn't they be real? Does he strike you as being a foreigner? Certainly not. He looks like an Englishman, and he speaks like one. And not, I should say, of the lowest class. It is true that there is a very curious, a weird quality in his voice, what I have heard of it, but it is not un-English. If it is catalepsy he is suffering from, then it is a kind of catalepsy I never heard of. Have you ever seen a clairvoyant? I nodded. He seems to me to be in a state of clairvoyance. Of course, the doctor laughed when I told him so, but we know what doctors are, and I still believe that he is in some condition of the kind. When he said that last night, he struck me as being under what those sort of people call influence, and that whoever had him under influence was forcing him to speak against his will, for the words came from his lips as if they had been wrung from him in agony. Knowing what I did know, that struck me as being rather a remarkable conclusion for her to have reached by the exercise of her own unaided powers of intuition, but I did not choose to let her know I thought so. My dear Marjorie, you who pride yourself on having your imagination so strictly under control, on suffering it to take no errant flights, is not the fact that I do so pride myself proof that I am not likely to make assertions wildly? Proof, at any rate, to you? Listen to me. When I left that unfortunate creature's room, I had had a nurse sent for. I left him in her charge and reached my own bedroom. I was possessed by a profound conviction that some appalling, intangible, but very real danger was at that moment threatening Paul. Remember, you had had an exciting evening and a discussion with your father. Your patient's words came as a climax. That is what I told myself. Or rather, that was what I tried to tell myself, because, in some extraordinary fashion, I had lost the command of my powers of reflection. Precisely, it was not precisely, or at least it was not precisely in the sense you mean. You may laugh at me, Sydney, but I had an altogether indescribable feeling, a feeling which amounted to knowledge that I was in the presence of the supernatural. Nonsense. It was not nonsense. I wish it had been nonsense. As I have said, I was conscious, completely conscious, that some frightful peril was assailing Paul. I did not know what it was, but I did know that it was something altogether awful, of which merely to think was to shudder. I wanted to go to his assistance. I tried to, more than once, but I couldn't, and I knew that I couldn't. I knew that I couldn't move as much as a finger to help him. Stop, let me finish. I told myself that it was absurd, but it wouldn't do. Absurd or not, there was the terror with me in the room. I knelt down and I prayed, but the words wouldn't come. I tried to ask God to remove this burden from my brain, but my longings wouldn't shape themselves into words, and my tongue was palsied. I don't know how long I struggled, but at last I came to understand that for some cause, God had chosen to leave me to fight the fight alone. So I got up and undressed and went to bed, and that was the worst of all. I had sent my maid away in the first rush of my terror, afraid, and I think ashamed, to let her see my fear. Now I would have given anything to summon her back again, but I couldn't do it. I couldn't even ring the bell. So, as I say, I got into bed. She paused, as if to collect her thoughts. To listen to her words, and to think of the suffering which they meant to her, was almost more than I could endure. I would have thrown away the world to have been able to take her in my arms and soothe her fears. I knew her to be, in general, the least hysterical of young women, little wont to become the prey of mere delusions, and incredible though it sounded, I had an innate conviction that even in its wildest periods, her story had some sort of basis in solid fact. What that basis amounted to, it would be my business, at any and every cost, quickly to determine. You know how you have always laughed at me because of my objection to cockroaches, and how, in spring, the neighbourhood of maybugs has always made me uneasy. As soon as I got into bed, I felt that something of the kind was in the room. Something of what kind? Some kind of beetle. I could hear the whirring of its wings. I could hear its droning in the air. I knew that it was hovering above my head, that it was coming lower and lower, nearer and nearer. I hid myself. I covered myself all over with the clothes. Then I felt it bumping against the coverlet. And Sydney, she drew closer. Her blanched cheeks and frightened eyes made my heart bleed. Her voice became but an echo of itself. It followed me. Marjorie, it got into the bed. You imagined it. I didn't imagine it. I heard it crawl along the sheets till it found a way between them. And then it crawled towards me, and I felt it against my face. And it's there now. Where? She raised the forefinger of her left hand. There. Can't you hear it droning? She listened intently. I listened too. Oddly enough, at that instant, the droning of an insect did become audible. It's only a bee, child, which has found its way through the open window. I wish it were only a bee. I wish it were. Sydney, don't you feel as if you were in the presence of evil? Don't you want to get away from it, back into the presence of God? Marjorie! Pray, Sydney, pray. I can't. I don't know why, but I can't. She flung her arms about my neck and pressed herself against me in paroxysmal agitation. The violence of her emotion bade fair to unman me too. It was so unlike Marjorie, and I would have given my life to save her from a toothache. She kept repeating her own words, as if she could not help it. "Pray, Sydney, pray." At last I did as she wished me. At least there is no harm in praying. I never heard of its bringing hurt to anyone. I repeated aloud the Lord's Prayer, the first time for I know not how long. As the divine sentences came from my lips, hesitatingly enough, I make no doubt, her tremors ceased. She became calmer, until, as I reached the last great petition, "Deliver us from evil," she loosed her arms from about my neck and dropped upon her knees, close to my feet, and she joined me in the closing words, as a sort of chorus. "For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, for ever and ever. Amen." When the prayer was ended, we both of us were still, she with her head bowed and her hands clasped, and I with something tugging at my heartstrings, which I had not felt there for many and many a year, almost as if it had been my mother's hand. I dare say that sometimes she does stretch out her hand from her place among the angels to touch my heartstrings, and I know nothing of it all the while. As the silence still continued, I chanced to glance up, and there was old Lyndon peeping at us from his hiding place behind the screen. The look of amazed perplexity which was on his big red face struck me with such a keen sense of the incongruous that it was all I could do to keep from laughter. Apparently, the sight of us did nothing to lighten the fog which was in his brain, for he stammered out, in what was possibly intended for a whisper, Is she mad?" The whisper, if it was meant for a whisper, was more than sufficiently audible to catch his daughter's ears. She started, raised her head, sprang to her feet, turned and saw her father. "Papa!" Immediately her sire was seized with an access of stuttering. "What the devil's the meaning of this?" Her utterance was clear enough. I fancy her parent found it almost painfully clear. Rather it is for me to ask, what is the meaning of this? Is it possible that all the time you have actually been concealed behind that screen? Unless I am mistaken, the old gentleman cowered before the directness of his daughter's gaze, and endeavoured to conceal the fact by an explosion of passion. "Don't you speak to me like that, you undutiful girl. I'm your father." "You certainly are my father, though I was unaware until now that my father was capable of playing the part of eavesdropper." Rage rendered him speechless, or at any rate, he chose to let us believe that that was the determining cause of his continuing silent. So Marjorie turned to me, and on the whole, I had rather she had not. Her manner was very different from what it had been just now. It was more than civil. It was freezing. "Am I to understand, Mr. Atherton, that this has been done with your cognizance? That while you suffered me to pour out my heart to you unchecked, you were aware, all the time, that there was a listener behind the screen?" I became keenly aware, on a sudden, that I had borne my share in playing her a very shabby trick. I should have liked to throw old Lyndon through the window. The thing was not of my contriving. Had I had the opportunity, I would have compelled Mr. Lyndon to face you when you came in, but your distress caused me to lose my balance, and you will do me the justice to remember that I endeavoured to induce you to come with me into another room. But I do not seem to remember your hinting at there being any particular reason why I should have gone. You never gave me a chance. Sydney, I had not thought you would have played me such a trick. When she said that, in such a tone, the woman whom I loved, I could have hammered my head against the wall. The hound I was to have treated her so scurvily. Perceiving I was crushed, she turned again to face her father, cool, calm, stately. She was, on a sudden, once more, the Marjorie with whom I was familiar. The demeanour of parent and child was in striking contrast. If appearances went for aught, the odds were heavy that in any encounter which might be coming the senior would suffer. "I hope, Papa, that you are going to tell me that there has been some curious mistake, and that nothing was farther from your intention than to listen at a keyhole. What would you have thought and said if I had attempted to play the spy on you? And I have always understood that men were so particular on points of honour." Old Lyndon was still hardly fit to do much else than splutter, certainly not qualified to chop phrases with this sharp-tongued maiden. Don't talk to me like that, girl. I believe you're stark mad." He turned to me. What was that tomfoolery she was talking to you about?" To what do you allude? About a rubbishing beetle, and goodness alone knows what. Diseased and morbid imagination, reared on the literature of the gutter. I never thought that a child of mine could have sunk to such a depth. Now, Atherton, I ask you to tell me frankly, what do you think of a child who behaves as she has done? Who takes a nameless vagabond into the house and conceals his presence from her father, and mark the sequel? Even the vagabond warns her against the rascal Lessingham. Now, Atherton, tell me what you think of a girl who behaves like that. I shrugged my shoulders. I know very well what you do think of her. Don't be afraid to say it out because she's present. No, Sidney, don't be afraid. I saw that her eyes were dancing. In a manner of speaking, her looks brightened under the sunshine of her father's displeasure. Let's hear what you think of her as a man of the world. Pray, Sidney, do. What you feel for her in your heart of hearts. Yes, Sidney, what do you feel for me in your heart of hearts? The baggage beamed with heartless sweetness. She was making a mock of me. Her father turned as if he would have rent her. Don't you speak until you're spoken to. Atherton, I hope I'm not deceived in you. I hope you're the man I took you for, that you're willing and ready to play the part of an honest friend to this misguided simpleton. This is not the time for mincing words. It's the time for candid speech. Tell this weak-minded young woman right out whether this man Lessingham is or is not a damned scoundrel. Papa, do you really think that Sidney's opinion, or your opinion, is likely to alter facts? Do you hear, Atherton? Tell this wretched girl the truth. My dear Mr. Linden, I have already told you that I know nothing either for or against Mr. Lessingham except what is known to all the world. Exactly. And all the world knows him to be a miserable adventurer who is scheming to entrap my daughter. I'm bound to say, since you press me, that your language appears to me to be unnecessarily strong. Atherton, I'm ashamed of you. You see, Sidney, even Papa is ashamed of you. Now you are outside the pale. My dear Papa, if you will allow me to speak, I will tell you what I know to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That Mr. Lessingham is a man with great gifts goes without saying. Permit me, Papa. He is a man of genius. He is a man of honour. He is a man of the loftiest ambitions, of the highest aims. He has dedicated his whole life to the improvement of the conditions amidst which the less fortunate of his fellow countrymen are at present compelled to exist. That seems to me to be an object well worth having. He has asked me to share his life work, and I have told him that I will. When and where and how he wants me to, and I will. I do not suppose his life has been free from peccadilloes. I have no delusion on the point. What man's life has? Who among men can claim to be without sin? Even the members of our highest families sometimes hide behind screens. But I know that he is, at least, as good a man as I ever met. I am persuaded that I shall never meet a better, and I thank God that I have found favour in his eyes. Goodbye, Sidney. I suppose I shall see you again, Papa. With the merest inclination of her head to both of us, she straightway left the room. Linden would have stopped her. Stay, you... He stuttered, but I caught him by the arm. If you will be advised by me, you will let her go. No good purpose will be served by a multiplication of words. Atherton, I'm disappointed in you. You haven't behaved as I expected. I haven't received from you the assistance which I looked for. My dear Linden, it seems to me that your method of diverting the young lady from the path which she has set herself to tread is calculated to send her furiously along it. Confound the women! Confound the women! I don't mind telling you in confidence that at times her mother was the devil, and I'll be hanged if her daughter isn't worse. What was the tomfoolery she was talking to you about? Is she mad? No, I don't think she's mad. I never heard such stuff. It made my blood run cold to hear her. What's the matter with the girl? Well, you must excuse my saying that I don't fancy you quite understand women. I don't, and I don't want to either. I hesitated, then resolved on a taradiddle in Marjorie's interest. Marjorie is high-strung, extremely sensitive. Her imagination is quickly aflame. Perhaps last night you drove her as far as was safe. You heard for yourself how, in consequence, she suffered. You don't want people to say you have driven her into a lunatic asylum. Good heavens, no. I'll send for the doctor directly I get home. I'll have the best opinion in town. You'll do nothing of the kind. You'll only make her worse. What you have to do is to be patient with her and let her have peace. As for this affair of Lessingham's, I have a suspicion that it may not be all such plain sailing as she supposes. What do you mean? I mean nothing. I only wish you to understand that until you hear from me again, you had better let matters slide. Give the girl her head. Give the girl her head? Haven't I given the girl her head all her life? He looked at his watch. Why, the day's half gone. He began scurrying towards the front door, I following at his heels. I've got a committee meeting on at the club. Most important. For weeks they've been giving us the worst food you ever tasted in your life. I played havoc with my digestion, and I'm going to tell them if things aren't changed, they'll have to pay my doctor's bills. As for that man, Lessingham. As he spoke, he himself opened the hall door, and there, standing on the step, was that man Lessingham himself. Lyndon was a picture. The apostle was as cool as a cucumber. He held out his hand. Good morning, Mr. Lyndon. What delightful weather we are having. Lyndon put his hand behind his back and behaved as stupidly as he very well could have done. You will understand, Mr. Lessingham, that in future I don't know you, and that I shall decline to recognise you anywhere, and that what I say applies equally to any member of my family. With his hat very much on the back of his head, he went down the steps like an inflated turkey cock. Chapter 22. The Haunted Man. To have received the cut discourteous from his future father-in-law might have been the most commonplace of incidents. Lessingham evinced not a trace of discomposure. So far as I could judge, he took no notice of the episode whatever, behaving exactly as if nothing had happened. He merely waited till Mr. Lyndon was well off the steps. Then, turning to me, he placidly observed, "Interrupting you again, you see. May I?" The sight of him had set up such a turmoil in my veins that for the moment I could not trust myself to speak. I felt acutely that an explanation with him was, of all things, the thing most to be desired, and that quickly. Providence could not have thrown him more opportunely in the way. If before he went away we did not understand each other a good deal more clearly upon certain points, the fault should not be mine. Without a responsive word, turning on my heels, I led the way into the laboratory. Whether he noticed anything peculiar in my demeanour, I could not tell. Within, he looked about him with that purely facial smile, the sight of which had always engendered in me a certain distrust of him. "Do you always receive visitors in here?" "By no means. What is this?" Stooping down, he picked up something from the floor. It was a lady's purse, a gorgeous affair of crimson leather and gleaming gold. Whether it was Marjorie's or Miss Grayling's, I could not tell. He watched me as I examined it. "Is it yours?" "No, it is not mine." Placing his hat and umbrella on one chair, he placed himself upon another, very leisurely. Crossing his legs, laying his folded hands upon his knees, he sat and looked at me. I was quite conscious of his observation, but endured it in silence, being a little wishful that he should begin. Presently he had, as I suppose, enough of looking at me, and spoke. "Atherton, what is the matter with you? Have I done something to offend you too? Why do you ask? Your manner seems a little singular." "You think so?" "I do. What have you come to see me about?" "Just now, nothing. I like to know where I stand." His manner was courteous, easy, even graceful. I was outmanoeuvred. I understood the man sufficiently well to be aware that when once he was on the defensive, the first blow would have to come from me, so I struck it. "I also like to know where I stand. Lessingham, I am aware, and you know that I am aware, that you have made certain overtures to Miss Lyndon. That is a fact in which I am keenly interested." "As how?" "The Lyndons and the Athertons are not the acquaintances of one generation only. Marjorie Lyndon and I have been friends since childhood. She looks upon me as a brother." "As a brother? As a brother?" "Yes. Mr. Linden regards me as a son. He has given me his confidence. As I believe you are aware, Marjorie has given me hers, and now I want you to give me yours. What do you want to know? I wish to explain my position before I say what I have to say, because I want you to understand me clearly. I believe, honestly, that the thing I most desire in this world is to see Marjorie Linden happy. If I thought she would be happy with you, I should say, Godspeed you both, and I should congratulate you with all my heart, because I think that you would have won the best girl in the whole world to be your wife. I think so too. But before I did that, I should have to see, at least, some reasonable probability that she would be happy with you. Why should she not? Will you answer a question? What is the question? What is the story in your life of which you stand in such hideous terror? There was a perceptible pause before he answered. Explain yourself. No explanation is needed. You know perfectly well what I mean. You credit me with miraculous acumen. Don't juggle, Lessingham. Be frank. The frankness should not be all on one side. There is that in your frankness, although you may be unconscious of it, which some men might not unreasonably resent. Do you resent it? That depends. If you are arrogating to yourself the right to place yourself between Miss Linden and me, I do resent it, strongly. Answer my question. I answer no question which is addressed to me in such a tone. He was as calm as you please. I recognized that already I was in peril of losing my temper, which was not at all what I desired. I eyed him intently, he returning me look for look. His countenance betrayed no sign of a guilty conscience. I had not seen him more completely at his ease. He smiled, facially, and also, as it seemed to me, a little derisively. I'm bound to admit that his bearing showed not the faintest shadow of resentment, and that in his eyes there was a gentleness, a softness, which I had not observed in them before. I could almost have suspected him of being sympathetic. In this matter, you must know, I stand in the place of Mr. Linden. Well, surely you must understand that before anyone is allowed to think of marriage with Marjorie Linden, he will have to show that his past, as the advertisements have it, will bear the fullest investigation. Is that so? Will your past bear the fullest investigation? I winced. At any rate, it is known to all the world. Is it? Forgive me if I say I doubt it. I doubt if, of any wise man, that can be said with truth. In all our lives there are episodes which we keep to ourselves. I felt that that was so true that for the instant I hardly knew what to say. But there are episodes and episodes, and when it comes to a man being haunted, one draws the line. Haunted? As you are. He got up. Atherton, I think that I understand you, but I fear that you do not understand me. He went to where a self-acting mercurial air pump was standing on a shelf. What is this curious arrangement of glass tubes and bulbs? I do not think that you do understand me, or you would know that I am in no mood to be trifled with. Is it some kind of an exhauster? My dear Lessingham, I'm entirely at your service. I intend to have an answer to my question before you leave this room, but in the meanwhile, your convenience is mine. There are some very interesting things here which you might care to see. Marvellous, is it not, how the human intellect progresses, from conquest unto conquest? Among the ancients, the progression had proceeded farther than with us. In what respect? For instance, in the affair of the apotheosis of the Beetle. I saw it take place last night. Where? Here, within a few feet of where you are standing. Are you serious? Perfectly. What did you see? I saw the legendary apotheosis of the Beetle performed last night before my eyes, with a gaudy magnificence at which the legends never hinted. That is odd. I once thought that I saw something of the kind myself. So I understand. From whom? From a friend of yours. From a friend of mine. Are you sure it was from a friend of mine? The man's attempt at coolness did him credit, but it did not deceive me. That he thought I was endeavouring to bluff him out of his secret, I perceived quite clearly. That it was a secret which he would only render with his life I was beginning to suspect. Had it not been for Marjorie, I should have cared nothing. His affairs were his affairs, though I realised perfectly well that there was something about the man which, from the scientific explorer's point of view, might be well worth finding out. Still, as I say, if it had not been for Marjorie, I should have let it go. But since she was so intimately concerned in it, I wondered more and more what it could be. My attitude towards what is called the supernatural is an open one. That all things are possible, I unhesitatingly believe. I have, even in my short time, seen so many so-called impossibilities proved possible. That we know everything, I doubt. That our great-great-great-great-grandsires, our forebears of thousands of years ago, of the extinct civilizations, knew more on some subjects than we do, I think is at least probable. All the legends can hardly be false. Because men claimed to be able to do things in those days which we cannot do, and which we do not know how they did, we profess to think that their claims are finally dismissed by exclaiming, "Lies!" But it is not so sure. For my part, what I had seen, I had seen. I had seen some devil's trick played before my very eyes. Some trick of the same sort seemed to have been played upon my Marjorie. I repeat that I write my Marjorie, because to me, she will always be me Marjorie. It had driven her half out of her senses. As I looked at Lessingham, I seemed to see her at his side, as I had seen her not long ago, with her white drawn face and staring eyes dumb with an agony of fear. Her life was bidding fair to be knit with his. What upas tree of horror was rooted in his very bones? The thought that her sweet purity was likely to be engulfed in a devil's slough in which he was wallowing was not to be endured, as I realized that the man was more than my match at the game which I was playing, in which such vital interests were at stake. My hands itched to clutch him by the throat and try another way. Doubtless my face revealed my feelings, because presently he said, "Are you aware how strangely you are looking at me, Atherton? Were my countenance a mirror, I think you would be surprised to see in it your own." I drew back from him, I dare say, sullenly. Not so surprised as yesterday morning you would have been to have seen yours. At the mere sight of a pictured scarab. How easily you quarrel. I do not quarrel. Then perhaps it's I. If that is so, then at once the quarrel's ended. Poof, it's done. Mr. Linden, I fear, because politically we differ, regards me as anathema. Has he put some of his spirit into you? You are a wiser man. I am aware that you are an adept with words, but this is a case in which words only will not serve. Then what will serve? I am myself beginning to wonder. And I, as you so courteously suggest, I believe I am wiser than Linden. I do not care for your politics, or for what you call your politics, one fig. I do not care if you are as other men are, as I am, not unspotted from the world, but I do care if you are leprous. And I believe you are. Atherton, ever since I have known you, I have been conscious of there being something about you which I found it difficult to diagnose. In an unwholesome sense, something out of the common, non-natural, an atmosphere of your own. Events, so far as you are concerned, have, during the last few days, moved quickly. They have thrown an uncomfortably lurid light on that peculiarity of yours which I have noticed. Unless you can explain them to my satisfaction, you will withdraw your pretensions to Miss Linden's hand, or I shall place certain facts before that lady, and if necessary, publish them to the world. He grew visibly paler, but he smiled. Facially. You have your own way of conducting a conversation, Mr. Atherton. What are the events to whose rapid transit you are alluding? Who was the individual, practically stark naked, who came out of your house in such singular fashion at dead of night? Is that one of the facts with which you propose to tickle the public ear? Is that the only explanation which you have to offer? Proceed, for the present, with your indictment. I am not so unobservant as you appear to imagine. There were features about the episode which struck me forcibly at the time, and which have struck me more forcibly since. To suggest, as you did yesterday morning, that it was an ordinary case of burglary, or that the man was a lunatic, is an absurdity. Pardon me, I did nothing of the kind. Then what do you suggest? I suggested, and do suggest, nothing. All the suggestions come from you. You went very much out of your way to beg me to keep the matter quiet. There is an appearance of suggestion about that. You take a jaundiced view of all my actions, Mr. Atherton. Nothing, to me, could seem more natural. However, proceed. He had his hands behind his back, and rested them on the edge of the table against which he was leaning. He was undoubtedly ill at ease, but so far I had not made the impression on him, either mentally or morally, which I desired. Who is your Oriental friend? I do not follow you. Are you sure? I am certain. Repeat your question. Who is your Oriental friend? I was not aware that I had one. Do you swear that? He laughed a strange laugh. Do you seek to catch me tripping? You conduct your case with too much animus. You must allow me to grasp the exact purport of your inquiry before I can undertake to reply to it on oath. Are you not aware that at present there is in London an individual who claims to have had a very close and a very curious acquaintance with you in the East? I'm not. That you swear? That I do swear. That is singular. Why is it singular? Because I fancy that that individual haunts you, haunts me, haunts you. You jest. You think so? You remember that picture of the Scarabaeus which, yesterday morning, frightened you into a state of semi-idiocy. You use strong language. I know what you allude to. Do you mean to say that you don't know that you were indebted for that to your Oriental friend? I don't understand you. Are you sure? Certainly I am sure. It occurs to me, Mr. Atherton, that an explanation is demanded from you rather than from me. Are you aware that the purport of my presence here is to ask you how that picture found its way into your room? It was projected by the Lord of the Beetle. The words were chance ones, but they struck a mark. The Lord... He faltered and stopped. He showed signs of discomposure. I will be frank with you, since frankness is what you ask. His smile, that time, was obviously forced. Recently, I have been the victim of delusions. There was a pause before the word. Of a singular kind. I have feared that they were the result of mental overstrain. Is it possible that you can enlighten me as to their source? I was silent. He was putting a great strain upon himself, but the twitching of his lips betrayed him. A little more, and I should reach the other side of Mr. Lessingham, the side which he kept hidden from the world. Who is this individual whom you speak of as my Oriental friend? Being your friend, you should know better than I do. What sort of man is he to look at? I did not say it was a man, but I presume it is a man. I did not say so. He seemed, for a moment, to hold his breath, and he looked at me with eyes which were not friendly. Then, with a display of self-command which did him credit, he drew himself upright, with an air of dignity which well became him. Atherton, consciously or unconsciously, you are doing me a serious injustice. I do not know what conception it is which you have formed of me, or on what the conception is founded, but I protest that, to the best of my knowledge and belief, I am as reputable, as honest, and as clean a man as you are. But you're haunted. Haunted. He held himself erect, looking me straight in the face. Then a shiver went all over him. The muscles of his mouth twitched, and in an instant he was livid. He staggered against the table. Yes, God knows it's true. I'm haunted. So either you're mad and therefore unfit to marry, or else you've done something which places you outside the tolerably generous boundaries of civilized society and are therefore still more unfit to marry. You're on the horns of a dilemma. I'm the victim of a delusion. What is the nature of the delusion? Does it take the shape of a beetle? Atherton, without the slightest warning, he collapsed, was transformed. I can describe the change which took place in him in no other way. He sank in a heap on the floor. He held up his hands above his head, and he gibbered, like some frenzied animal. A more uncomfortable spectacle than he presented it would be difficult to find. I have seen it matched in the padded rooms of lunatic asylums, but nowhere else. The sight of him set every nerve of my body on edge. In heaven's name, what is the matter with you, man? Are you stark, staring mad? Here, drink this. Filling a tumbler with brandy, I forced it between his quivering fingers. Then it was some moments before I could get him to understand what it was I wanted him to do. When he did get the glass to his lips, he swallowed its contents as if they were so much water. By degrees, his senses returned to him. He stood up. He looked about him with a smile which was positively ghastly. It's a delusion. It's a very queer kind of a delusion, if it is. I eyed him curiously. He was evidently making the most strenuous efforts to regain his self-control, all the while with that horrible smile about his lips. Atherton, you take me at an advantage. I was still. Who's your Oriental friend? My Oriental friend. You mean yours? I supposed, at first, that the individual in question was a man, but it appears that she's a woman. A woman? Oh, how do you mean? Well, the face is a man's, of an uncommonly disagreeable type, of which the powers forbid that there are many, and the voice is a man's, also of a kind. But the body, as last night I chanced to discover, is a woman's. That sounds very odd. He closed his eyes. I could see that his cheeks were clammy. Do you believe in witchcraft? That depends. Have you heard of Obi? I have. I have been told that an Obeah man can put a spell upon a person which compels a person to see whatever he, the Obeah man, may please. Do you think that's possible? It is not a question to which I should be disposed to answer either yes or no. He looked at me out of his half-closed eyes. It struck me that he was making conversation, saying anything for the sake of gaining time. I remember reading a book entitled Obscure Diseases of the Brain. It contained some interesting data on the subject of hallucinations. Possibly. Now, candidly, would you recommend me to place myself in the hands of a mental pathologist? I don't think that you're insane, if that's what you mean. No? That is good hearing. Of all diseases, insanity is the most to be dreaded. Well, Atherton, I'm keeping you. The truth is that, insane or not, I'm very far from well. I think I must give myself a holiday. He moved towards his hat and umbrella. There is something else which you must do. What is that? You must resign your pretensions to Miss Linden's hand. My dear Atherton, if my health is really failing me, I shall resign everything, everything. He repeated his own word, with a little movement of his hands which was pathetic. Understand me, Lessingham. What else you do is no affair of mine. I am concerned only with Miss Linden. You must give me your definite promise, before you leave this room, to terminate your engagement with her before tonight. His back was towards me. There will come a time when your conscience will prick you because of your treatment of me, when you will realize that I am the most unfortunate of men. I realize that now. It is because I realize it that I am so desirous that the shadow of your evil fortune shall not fall upon an innocent girl. He turned. Atherton, what is your actual position with reference to Marjorie Linden? She regards me as a brother. And do you regard her as a sister? Are your sentiments towards her purely fraternal? You know that I love her. And do you suppose that my removal will clear the path for you? I suppose nothing of the kind. You may believe me or not, but my one desire is for her happiness, and surely, if you love her, that is your desire too. That is so. He paused. An expression of sadness stole over his face, of which I had not thought it capable. That is so to an extent of which you do not dream. No man likes to have his hand forced, especially by one whom he regards, may I say it, as a possible rival. But I will tell you this much. If the blight which has fallen on my life is likely to continue, I would not wish, God forbid that I should wish to join her fate with mine, not for all that the world could offer me. He stopped, and I was still. Presently he continued. When I was younger, I was subject to a similar delusion, but it vanished. I saw no trace of it for years. I thought that I had done with it for good. Recently, however, it has returned, as you have witnessed. I shall institute inquiries into the cause of its reappearance. If it seems likely to be irremovable, or even if it bids fair to be prolonged, I shall not only, as you phrase it, withdraw my pretensions to Miss Linden's hand, but to all my other ambitions. In the interim, as regards Miss Linden, I shall be careful to hold myself on the footing of a mere acquaintance. You promise me? I do. And on your side, Atherton, in the meantime, deal with me more gently. Judgment in my case has still to be given. You will find that I am not the guilty wretch you apparently imagine, and there are few things more disagreeable to one's self-esteem than to learn, too late, that one has persisted in judging another man too harshly. Think of all that the world has at this moment to offer me, and what it will mean if I have to turn my back on it, owing to a mischievous twist of fortune's wheel. He turned as if to go, then stopped, and looked round, in an attitude of listening. What's that? There was a sound of droning. I recalled what Marjorie had said of her experiences of the night before. It was like the droning of a beetle. The instant the apostle heard it, The fashion of his countenance began to change. It was pitiable to witness. I rushed to him. "Lessingham, don't be a fool. Play the man." He gripped my left arm with his right hand, till it felt as if it were being compressed in a vice. Then, "I shall have to have some more brandy." Fortunately, the bottle was within reach from where I stood. Otherwise, I doubt if he would have released my arm to let me get at it. I gave him the decanter and the glass. He helped himself to a copious libation. By the time that he had swallowed it, the droning sound had gone. He put down the empty tumbler. When a man has to resort to alcohol to keep his nerves up to concert pitch, things are in a bad way with him. You may be sure of that. But then, you have never known what it is to stand in momentary expectation of a tête-à-tête with the devil. Again he turned to leave the room, and this time he actually went. I let him go alone. I heard his footsteps passing along the passage, and the hall door close. Then I sat in an armchair, stretched my legs out in front of me, thrust my hands in my trouser pockets, and I wondered. I had been there, perhaps, 4 or 5 minutes, when there was a slight noise at my side. Glancing round, I saw a sheet of paper come fluttering through the open window. It fell almost at my feet. I picked it up. It was a picture of a beetle, a facsimile of the one which had had such an extraordinary effect on Mr. Lessingham the day before. If this was intended for St. Paul, it's a trifle late, unless... I could hear that someone was approaching along the corridor. I looked up, expecting to see the apostle reappear, in which expectation I was agreeably disappointed. The newcomer was feminine. It was Miss Grayling. As she stood in the open doorway, I saw that her cheeks were red as roses. "I hope I am not interrupting you again, but I left my purse here." She stopped, then added, as if it were an afterthought, "And I want you to come and lunch with me." I locked the picture of the beetle in the drawer, and I lunched with Dora Grayling. And so, dear listener, we reach the chilling conclusion of Book 2 of The Beetle, a tale that grows darker with every turn of the page. The mysteries deepen, the shadows lengthen, and the horror lurking in the night is far from over. Thank you for listening to this installment of The Beetle. If you're captivated by this eerie and forgotten classic, be sure to like this video, subscribe to Fireside Classics, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next thrilling chapters. In Book 3, the terror intensifies, and the truth behind the beetle's horrifying power begins to unfold. Stay tuned, the nightmare is only beginning. If you're enjoying our collection of Gothic horror and supernatural classics, you might also love The Canterville Ghost, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, or our Forgotten Horror and Gothic Thrillers playlist. What do you think is the true nature of the beetle? Let us know your theories in the comments. Thank you for listening, and until next time, may your nights be free of shadows and things that watch from the darkness.